70 years ago, in Riverside Park in New York, a 4-year-old boy vanished without a trace during a family picnic, leaving behind only his small cap on the grass and a city gripped by fear. Authorities suspected a man wearing a fedora, who was seen leaving the park in a black Ford, of being involved in the disappearance. But with no body found, no concrete evidence, and the investigation ultimately reaching a dead end, the case faded. Yet for decades afterward, a mother refused to believe her son was dead, keeping his small room intact, as if awaiting a miracle. Then one day, when modern DNA technology opened a window into the past, a seemingly minor detail emerged, and it would fundamentally alter the understanding of a case that had lain dormant for more than half a century. Before delving into this shocking story, please let us know where you are watching from, and if you enjoy cases that are solved after decades, please subscribe so you do not miss the next video. New York in 1955 was a city of ceaseless sounds. The screech of streetcars crossing iron bridges, the calls of pretzel vendors from street corners, the swing music from radios spilling out of third-floor windows in red brick tenements. On the west side, the lives of immigrant families were gradually stabilizing after the war, with narrow streets running parallel to the Hudson River, illuminated by the signs of laundries, diners, and shoe repair shops. People believed it was a safe city for children, where they could run and play in the parks without fear. The Ramirez family lived in a small 2-room apartment overlooking 108th Street. Carlos, the father, who worked at a ship repair yard at the Hudson docks, was reserved and taciturn. Elena, the mother, worked at a nearby laundry and was always careful and cautious, and James, their 4-year-old son with bright black eyes and soft curly hair, was their small source of joy. That Sunday morning, following their weekend routine, Elena took James to Riverside Park, accompanied by her 19-year-old sister Alicia, who enjoyed taking photographs. Carlos had to work an extra shift at the yard and instructed his wife not to let the boy get near the riverbank. At noon, under a clear sky, the birch trees cast shadows over the stone paths. James held a vanilla ice cream cone, eating it as he ran ahead, his small white shirt standing out amid the greenery. Elena and Alicia followed more slowly, occasionally pausing to snap a few casual photographs. The atmosphere was that of a peaceful family outing, children laughing, jazz music playing from a radio belonging to a nearby group of college students, adults reclining on the grass reading newspapers. In the moment, when Elena paused to retie her shoelace, her eyes briefly caught sight of a man standing several dozen feet away, wearing a dark coat despite the mild weather, and a fedora on his head. He did nothing conspicuous, merely standing and watching the children playing in the playground. Elena found it slightly odd, but turned her attention back to her son. The man remained still, blending into the crowd. James, meanwhile, had run after a pigeon, pecking at breadcrumbs, laughing gleefully. He moved farther from his mother, crossing the grass toward a small pond. Elena intended to call him back, but seeing he was only a few yards away, was not concerned. Alicia was preoccupied with her Kodak camera, bending down to load fresh film. When Elena looked up again, the man had approached James. He bent down, seemingly speaking to the boy from Elena's vantage point. The scene appeared ordinary, like an adult asking for directions. No one noticed anything amiss. Elena turned away for only a moment to retrieve a handkerchief from her handbag, and when she looked back, James was gone. Only the empty wooden bench and a few pigeons taking flight remained. She scanned the area, the pond, the paths, the playground, but saw no sign of her son. Alicia looked up and followed Elena's gaze, and the two began calling James's name, first softly, then louder. There was no response. A nearby couple said they had just seen a small boy walking with a man wearing a dark hat, heading toward the park's exit gate. The words left Elena stunned. The two rushed in that direction, but the thickening crowd made progress difficult. Their calls were lost amid the laughter, music, and distant sounds of car horns. Alicia ran through the narrow paths between grassy areas, asking each person she encountered, "Have you seen a curly-haired boy in a white shirt?" Some shook their heads. A few suggested he had simply run off to play somewhere nearby. Elena grew frantic, running to the playground and then out to the main path, her shoes slipping on the gravel. Her heart pounded, and all surrounding sounds seemed muffled. After searching everywhere without finding him, she stopped in the middle of the main walkway, her vision blurring with panic. Alicia spotted a patrolling officer on a bicycle near the park gate and waved desperately to summon him. Elena rushed over, sobbing and pointing inside the park, her words broken and incoherent. The officer stopped, recognized the panic in the mother's eyes, and immediately radioed an urgent report to the nearest precinct. Once the alert spread, the report of a child missing in Riverside Park quickly reached the duty officer for the area at the New York Police Department. Within 10 minutes, another patrol car arrived with 2 officers, who instructed bystanders to halt their uncoordinated searches so that a controlled perimeter could be established. Elena sat slumped on the wooden bench, her face ashen, a crumpled handkerchief clutched in her hand. Alicia stood beside her, attempting to explain what had happened, though her voice trembled and lacked coherence. The police asked when they had last seen James, which direction he had run, and what clothes he was wearing. The description was repeated: a white shirt, blue shorts, and light brown canvas shoes. While Elena struggled to recall every detail, another officer began securing the suspected area with yellow police tape. The crowd had not fully dispersed. Curious onlookers lingered, pointing and watching, while a few children continued running around the playground. A senior officer ordered people to clear the area near the pond, but the noise and confusion made containment difficult. Police focused on the location where James was last seen, the open space between the wooden bench, the stone walkway, and the grassy edge leading toward the western park gate. On the grass, they found faint impressions of small footprints, but the ground had been trampled by dozens of people during the initial search. A young officer knelt and measured them with a metal ruler, noting the size, though he knew the evidence was nearly useless due to the contaminated scene. At the edge of the path, in the shade of an oak tree, they found a crumpled piece of shiny silver paper, a wrapper from a type of gummy candy popular with children. An officer placed it in an evidence bag and marked it with red ink. Nearby, a thin strand of green wool was caught on a blade of grass. The evidence collector asked Elena if the boy's clothing contained wool. She shook her head, stating that his shirt was thin cotton, not wool. They recorded the detail, uncertain of its significance. Meanwhile, a park custodian informed them that the area was frequented by vendors, strollers, and all manner of children, meaning any trace could belong to anyone. Police ordered the secondary gates closed to limit access. The arrival of the investigative team was signaled by the sound of sirens. 2 plainclothes detectives, one named Arthur Blake, young and tall, with a lean build, moved quickly past the tape. After a brief exchange with the ranking officer and a review of the notes, Blake questioned Elena. With tear-filled eyes, she pointed toward the pond and said her son had run after a bird and then disappeared. Blake asked her to describe the man in the hat she had seen. She replied that she had only glimpsed him and could not make out his face. He noted the description, underlining the words "fedora" 3 times. Meanwhile, another group of officers followed the path leading to the western gate. Beneath the line of trees, they found scattered scraps of paper, a deflated balloon, and a shallow adult shoe print in damp soil. The print pointed out of the park, but its timing could not be determined. With so many people passing through at midday, coincidence was a strong possibility. Nevertheless, Blake ordered it photographed. He requested a park map and marked the key locations: the central playground, the wooden bench, the pond, and the western exit gate. Each point was numbered in chronological order based on Elena's and Alicia's statements. Once the diagram was complete, a copy was sent to the precinct for the case file. As the afternoon wore on under increasingly harsh sunlight, the continued presence of park visitors made preserving the scene more difficult. New footprints overlaid the old ones, and bits of debris were scattered by the wind. Police expanded the taped area twice, increasing the radius to nearly 100 yards. Blake checked his watch and decided to conclude the preliminary survey and elevate the case to formal investigation status. A brief report was drafted on-site and assigned a temporary case number based on the precinct NY55 2041. The collected evidence, the candy wrapper, wool strand, shoe print photographs, and marked map, was sealed and sent to storage. Blake signed the report, classifying the case as child missing, possible abduction. As dusk settled over the riverside trees, the park gradually emptied. Elena remained seated on the bench, staring blankly at the patch of grass where her son had vanished. A young officer approached quietly and told her they would continue searching through the night, but she barely registered his words. All sounds seemed distant. In the midst of the bustling city, a new case file had been opened, concerning a 4-year-old boy who disappeared in broad daylight, without verified witnesses, without clear traces, leaving only scattered fragments of what had seemed an ordinary midday outing. The following morning, the precinct conducted its first formal witness interviews at the station near Riverside Drive. Arthur Blake led the effort, assisted by 2 officers taking notes. 3 witnesses who had come forward were interviewed separately to avoid influencing one another's accounts. The first, Grace Miller, a woman in her 40s and an elementary school teacher, stated that she had been sitting on a bench opposite the playground when she saw a tall man in a dark coat and fedora approach the boy. She said the man bent down, spoke to the boy, who nodded, and then the 2 walked a few steps toward the pond. She claimed the man took the boy's hand, but when Blake asked if she was certain, she hesitated, saying it may have been only a light guiding touch. When pressed for a more detailed facial description, she replied that she could not see clearly because the man had his back to the sun. When shown a preliminary sketch, she said it matched about 80%. The second witness, Henry Lowe, an attendant at a parking lot 2 blocks away, said he had come to the park for lunch and sat on a bench near the oak trees, where he saw a boy in a white shirt chasing a flock of pigeons. He saw no one accompanying the boy, and recalled only the mother calling to him from a distance. When asked if he had seen the man in the hat, he insisted that no one was standing near the boy at that time, and that the crowded park made it hard to be certain. Blake noted this, and compared it to the timing of Elena's sighting of the stranger. According to Lowe's watch, he had left the park around 11:50, which aligned with the window of James's disappearance. The third witness, Robert Delaney, an 18-year-old morning paper delivery boy, stated that, while riding his bicycle along 95th Street near the Western Gate, he saw a small boy with curly hair wearing light-colored clothing being lifted into an old black Ford. He described the driver as a man of about 40 wearing a long coat but could not read the license plate because it was covered in mud. When asked if he was sure the child matched the Ramirez family's description, he hesitated, saying he had only caught a fleeting glimpse in the car's mirror and had assumed it was a father and son. Blake asked him to sketch the direction the car took. Delaney indicated it proceeded onto Amsterdam Avenue and merged into traffic on 97th Street. Police then cross-referenced the statements in an attempt to reconstruct a timeline. Miller placed the man and boy, leaving the playground toward the pond. Lowe insisted no one was near the boy, and Delaney placed the boy being lifted into a car near the Western Gate. Blake spread out a park map and marked the 3 locations: the central playground, the grassy area by the pond, and the Western Gate. Timings were estimated based on each witness's recollection, but varied by nearly 10 minutes, rendering the movement diagram convoluted. Blake recognized a gap between the moment Elena lost sight of her son and when Delaney saw the car. No one had directly observed what occurred in between. He suspected at least one statement contained inaccuracies or memory contamination. In the afternoon, 2 park employees were interviewed. Both reported seeing nothing unusual, only hearing a woman shouting, "James," a few minutes after the fact. Blake compiled all the information and wrote in his report that the witness statements lack consistency and do not form a clear sequence of events. He requested that the technical unit construct a timeline. 11:30. James was still in the playground. 11:40. Witness Lowe saw the boy chasing birds, 11:50. Miller saw the man bend down to speak to him. 12 o'clock, Delaney saw the boy being lifted into the black Ford. The unaccounted 15 minutes were a period no one could verify. Blake studied the map, crisscrossed with red ink lines, aware that these conflicting details would greatly complicate the investigation. Meanwhile, the afternoon newspapers had begun printing brief reports: 4-year-old boy mysteriously missing from Riverside Park. With the initial witness statements still tangled and inconclusive, Arthur Blake was compelled to launch a limited search along the Hudson River, the only direction suggested by the vague footprints and accounts. The following morning, under a gray sky, and with mist rising from the water, Riverside Park took on an unusually cold and desolate appearance. 3 rescue boats were dispatched from a nearby harbor station and divided into 2 groups to sweep the stretch of river from 95th Street to the 79th Street Bridge. Rescuers used wooden poles to probe the shoreline, while ground teams followed the disused rail line paralleling the embankment. Floating debris, trash, branches, paper, was hauled out for inspection and discarded. No signs of children's clothing or suspicious items were found. By noon, Blake stood on a pier overlooking the murky water and noted in his logbook that the water level was low, the wind light, and there were no eddies. A diver proposed searching the area around the bridge piers, where the current was slower, but after nearly 2 hours, only rusted junk was recovered, nothing relevant. While the rescue teams continued their sweeps, Elena was brought to the search area for confirmation. Barely able to stand, she shook her head and said James had never gone near the river because he was afraid of water. Blake noted this detail, adding to the record that the victim had no tendency to approach deep water. As the day wore on, a stronger river breeze carried the smell of oil and damp weeds to the bank. The search concluded late in the afternoon with no results, yielding only a few worthless samples. The initial report stated unequivocally no evidence of falling into the river or accidental drowning. Blake met briefly with his superiors and recommended shifting the investigative focus. The most likely scenario was that James had been removed from the park, possibly by motor vehicle. He ordered a re-examination of all park exits, compilation of lists of vendors, parking attendants, and other individuals present between 11 a.m. and noon. An officer familiar with the area reported that the western gate, which led to 95th Street, had no regular guard post, only a mobile ice cream vendor. They located the vendor, a middle-aged man named Frank, who recalled seeing a tall man in a dark coat, carrying a boy in light-colored clothing, pass his stand, though he could not pinpoint the time because he had been serving customers. Frank's account partially corroborated Delaney's statement, lending weight to the hypothesis that the boy had left the park in a vehicle. Blake marked the presumed path of movement on the map, with a red arrow extending from the playground to the western gate and onto Amsterdam Avenue, the same direction Delaney had described the black Ford taking. With the diagram complete, he concluded that the entire scenario had shifted beyond the park's boundaries. All indications of an accidental fall into the water had been eliminated. That evening, the investigative team planned to expand the search radius to adjacent streets. 2 officers were assigned to canvass every gas station, parking lot, and nearby store to determine if anyone had seen a suspicious vehicle. Most reported nothing. One parking attendant vaguely recalled an old Ford parked for about half an hour before departing, but could not recall the license plate. Blake added a note, strong possibility of deliberate removal. Meanwhile, the Ramirez family began distributing flyers bearing James's photograph, selected from the roll of film Alicia had shot that day. A slightly blurry but identifiable image of the curly-haired boy in a white shirt smiling. The flyers were printed at a small shop on Broadway, with neighbors assisting in posting them around the park and the waterfront. Each carried a simple message: missing, James Ramirez, age 4. Contact NYPD. As night fell, and the park's lights reflected on the river's surface, the remaining officers packed up their equipment and documented the day's fruitless search. Under the dim illumination, Blake reviewed the full report, No traces recovered from the water. No items belonging to the victim found. Beside the preliminary conclusion, he added a brief annotation: circumstances inconsistent with natural accident. Assumption removed from the scene. In the darkness along the Hudson's edge, the rumble of a passing freight train vibrated the ground, while Elena, in the small apartment on West 108th Street, sat by an open window gazing toward the river, where searchers had spent the entire day looking in vain, still convinced that her son was out there somewhere, not beneath the water. 2 days after the Riverside search was concluded, the latest report from the crime scene investigation team reached Arthur Blake's desk. At the top was a summary of the statement from witness Robert Delaney, who claimed to have seen a black Ford leaving the park around noon. The license plate, he recalled, consisted of 5 characters, with one letter obscured by mud: 7H4_2. The blank space became the focal point of the entire file. Blake immediately directed the Vehicle Registration Department to check all black Ford vehicles from the 1950-1951 model years with similar plates within the city and the 2 adjacent counties. The initial list exceeded 100 vehicles, including private cars, rental vehicles, and old delivery trucks. Each owner was detailed in a chart containing names, addresses, and registration histories. A team of investigators was dispatched to verify each case. Most of the vehicles had been sold, had their plates changed, or no longer existed. A few remained in operation but belonged to individuals who did not match the suspect's description. During the review, one officer identified a black Ford of the same model, registered in New Jersey, reported stolen 2 weeks prior. Blake considered this a potentially significant lead, as if the vehicle had been stolen before the disappearance. The kidnapper could have used it to avoid traceability. He contacted state police and requested the detailed file. The stolen vehicle's license plate was 7H412, the missing character matching Delaney's statement exactly. However, the records indicated that the vehicle had been found burned in a wooded area 10 miles outside the city, 4 days before James's disappearance. The discovery was a profound disappointment to the entire team. The vehicle was the right make and plate, but the timeline did not align. Nevertheless, Blake remained suspicious. He ordered a thorough examination of the vehicle fire report. The wooden frame and metal plates had been completely destroyed, leaving only the vehicle identification number. One hypothesis emerged: the license plate may have been removed from the burned vehicle and transferred to another. He noted possibility of using counterfeit plates or a recycled vehicle. While the investigative team worked with the registration department, new information arrived from the traffic control unit. On the day James disappeared, a camera at the George Washington Bridge Toll Plaza recorded an older model black Ford passing through toward New Jersey at 12:17 p.m. The image was blurry, but the vehicle's shape matched Delaney's description. Blake requested enlargement of the frame, but the technology of the time was limited. The image revealed only the vehicle's silhouette, with no discernible driver or child inside. A copy of the photograph was filed as preliminary evidence. That same evening, the investigative team checked gas stations and parking lots around 95th Street. One gas station attendant recalled a man driving a black Ford who stopped to refuel, paid in cash, and said little. The man wore leather gloves despite the mild weather. When asked about the license plate, the attendant could only recall a 7 and a 2 at the end. Blake requested a sketch of the man's face, but the witness's memory was vague, describing only light hair around 40 years old. Every detail remained fragmentary. The list of black Fords was narrowed to 13 vehicles whose ownership could not be verified on the day of the incident. Police visited each address, knocked on doors, inspected vehicles, and took statements. Most had verifiable alibis: one man working in a shop, another repairing a vehicle in a garage, one even out of state. None matched the description of the man wearing a fedora. As the review extended into the 3rd day, Blake wearily reread all the reports. Every lid concerning the vehicle led to a dead end. He examined a photograph of the park gate, where Delaney claimed to have seen the black Ford depart. reasoning that a single piece of physical evidence, a paint chip, a scrap of fabric, anything, might close the circle. He sent personnel back to the scene, retracing the path to Amsterdam Avenue. Beneath a layer of dry leaves, they discovered several flakes of chipped black paint, possibly fallen from a vehicle's undercarriage. The samples were taken to the technical laboratory. Preliminary analysis identified automotive paint, but lacked sufficient distinctiveness to determine the manufacturer. The report concluded, "Cannot confirm relevance." Blake underlined those words 3 times in the file. He began to believe the vehicle might have been stolen, equipped with fraudulent plates, and driven by someone experienced in evading detection. In submitting the report to his superiors, he added a final note: "The black Ford is the central element of this case. Further investigation is required into the possibility of swap plates or vehicle disposal after use." Late that evening in his office, with only the desk lamp illuminating the blurry photograph of the vehicle crossing the bridge, Blake, in a moment of silence, realized that the entire search was revolving around a vehicle that might never have existed in the manner they had assumed. After several fruitless days of pursuing leads on the black Ford, Blake shifted the investigation toward direct identification of the suspect. The vehicle appeared to have vanished without a trace, leaving the scattered witness statements about the man in the fedora as the only remaining thread. He contacted the Manhattan Police Department's identisketch artist and requested a composite sketch based on descriptions from 3 witnesses. That morning, the cramped studio was cleared to allow natural light. Grace Miller, the witness who had seen the man speaking with James, was brought in first. The artist placed before her a book of sketch templates and asked her to select the features closest to what she recalled. She chose deep-set eyes, a high-bridged nose, and thin lips. Henry Lowe, the second witness, was less certain, stating only that the man was probably tall and somewhat thin. The artist combined the details, incorporating the fedora and overcoat. After nearly 2 hours, the first sketch was completed: a middle-aged man approximately 40, with an angular face, eyes cast obliquely, and hat pulled low to shadow half his forehead. Blake studied the drawing, sensing it was both close and distant. It was clear enough to distribute, but insufficiently specific for a targeted manhunt. He approved the sketch and proceeded to the next step, printing wanted posters across the city. Within 2 days, hundreds of posters were distributed throughout the West Side, subway stations, gas stations, and major stores. Bold text at the top read, "NYPD seeks man possibly connected to child disappearance at Riverside Park." The sketch was centered below a brief description: approximately 6 feet tall, light hair, wearing a dark fedora and a long coat. The police department's telephone number was printed prominently. Newspapers reproduced the sketch and reported on the mysterious fedora-clad suspect. Within days, the department received more than 50 calls from citizens claiming to have seen someone matching the description in various locations, one in the Bronx, another in Queens, and even at Grand Central Terminal. Blake assigned personnel to verify each report. All proved false. Every man wearing a fedora in the city became a target of suspicion. A taxi driver was detained solely for resembling the sketch, and a worker was reported by neighbors for looking suspicious. Blake recognized that this wave of rumor could divert the investigation, but he had no alternative. Concurrently, he instructed the Records Division to review files on convicted sex offenders and individuals arrested for child abduction over the past 10 years. Hundreds of yellowed files were retrieved from dusty archives. Clerks worked through the night, screening for men matching the physical description. White males aged 35 to 45, tall stature, with prior activity in Manhattan or New Jersey. The list was reduced to 12 individuals. Their mugshots were compared to the sketch, none matched convincingly. 1. Raymond Koch, arrested for child molestation, owned a similar hat in his photograph, but he had been incarcerated at Sing Sing at the time of James's disappearance. 7 others had clear alibis, and the remaining 3 had left the state years earlier. The results left Blake frustrated. He wrote in the report, "No individual in the sex offender registry matches the suspect description. No evident connection to the Riverside case. Nevertheless, he ensured the sketch remained posted on the department's internal bulletin board in hopes that someone might recognize the face in another investigation. A few days later, a postal worker called, stating that the man in the sketch resembled a regular customer who frequently mailed large packages from the Amsterdam Avenue branch. Blake investigated immediately, but other employees identified the man as an unremarkable mail-order salesman. Every lead evaporated as quickly as it appeared. On his desk, amid stacks of newspapers and a city map marked with red ink, the sketch of the fedora-clad man lay neatly aligned, its corners beginning to curl. Blake studied it for a long time, then placed it in the main case file. He understood it was the only image the city possessed of the man who might have taken James, a nameless face among millions. Adrift in a sea of hat-wearing, overcoated figures, indistinguishable as a grain of sand in a New York dust storm. After several weeks of no progress from the black Ford or the fedora sketch, pressure from superiors and the public prompted a shift in the investigation. Some tabloid newspapers speculated that the disappearance might stem from a conflict within an immigrant family. The suggestion spread rapidly, forcing the police department to re-examine those closest to James. Blake was reluctant to pursue this direction, but followed procedure. On Monday morning, he and two officers visited the Ramirez family's small apartment on 108th Street for formal interviews. The single room, with yellowed walls stained by cooking smoke and a window overlooking a narrow alley, admitted only dim light. Carlos sat silently at the table, his face haggard and eyes sunken. Elena sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly. Blake systematically questioned their activities on the day of the disappearance, who had gone where and who had remained. Their answers matched prior statements. Carlos had been at the shipyard, working an extra shift, corroborated by coworkers. Internal investigators nonetheless required cross-verification. They contacted the shipyard foreman, confirmed hours worked, and matched them against payroll records. Everything aligned, with no indication of falsification. However, suspicion had begun to infiltrate conversations. Newspapers reported that police have not ruled out the possibility of family involvement. A statement sufficient to unsettle the neighborhood. When Blake returned for further information, some neighbors avoided his gaze, and others refused to answer their doors. He was compelled to visit each apartment individually, maintaining a neutral tone. A woman from the floor below stated she had heard the Ramirez couple argue a few times about money, though she knew no specifics. A grocer at the end of the block said Carlos frequently drank beer after work, and sometimes became loud when intoxicated. Blake recorded the information, but recognized it as inconsequential neighborhood gossip. Nevertheless, the investigative office opened a supplementary file and requested a financial review. The local bank confirmed a modest savings account with no debts or unusual withdrawals. No suspicious transactions occurred around the time of the disappearance. Tax records verified average income, consistent with manual labor. A search of the apartment yielded only family photographs, a few toys, and no incriminating items. Blake submitted a report. No physical or financial evidence implicating the disappearance has been found. No basis for suspecting the victim's parents, but the press did not await conclusions. The following day, the New York Evening Star ran a prominent article headlined, "What are James Ramirez's parents hiding?" The piece cited anonymous department sources claiming the mother displayed conflicting emotional responses and inconsistent statements. Elena read the article and collapsed completely. She refused to leave the apartment, fearing neighbors' stares. Carlos angrily sought out the newspaper's offices, but was denied access. Blake, upon hearing of the situation, visited to reassure them and advised against responding to media requests, but his counsel provided little relief. In the West Side neighborhood, residents began whispering, and some avoided greeting the family. Patrolling officers became cautious when passing the building, wary of appearing to defend them. Within the department, some theorized that Elena had fabricated the man in the fedora to conceal something, since no one else had seen him clearly. Blake rejected the hypothesis, but was compelled by pressure to conduct a formal interrogation at headquarters. Elena was brought to a small room and questioned by two investigators seated across from her. They repeated the same questions: how long she had observed the man, why she had not immediately called out, and why she had allowed her son to move so far away. In tears, and with an exhausted voice, Elena replied that she did not know. When the interrogation concluded, Blake left the room with a bitter feeling. He knew valuable time was being wasted, but there was no way to halt the machinery of the investigation. Meanwhile, the press hounded the family, photographing them in the street and attaching malicious captions: "Mother weeps to hide guilt," or "Secrets in the immigrant apartment." A weekend edition even recreated the scene in an illustrated reconstruction, introducing false details such as young James frequently scolded for mischief. The spreading rumors caused former supporters, including those who had helped distribute flyers, to withdraw. Alicia, the younger sister, attempted to defend Elena, but was pursued by reporters at her workplace. Blake submitted a formal request to cease irresponsible reporting, but it was ignored. In meetings, superiors stated only that the public demands answers. Gradually, the investigative focus shifted from the unknown man in the fedora to the possibility of internal involvement. Blake ordered a final comprehensive review of all evidence, physical items, timelines, and statements. Everything indicated no family connection to the disappearance. He drafted a 3-page report recommending closure of this investigative avenue. In a firm, deliberate hand, he wrote the final line: "No evidence exists of criminal activity by family members." Conclusion: suspect is an outsider. The report was submitted without fanfare. Concurrently, the media moved on to other stories, but the damage inflicted on the Ramirez family lingered. Elena sat for hours by the window, silent. Carlos returned to the shipyard, avoiding contact with co-workers. In the police office, Blake removed the fedora sketch from the bulletin board and carefully rolled it up. He knew he had spent nearly a month proving what he had believed from the outset. The person who took James was not from the cramped apartment on 108th Street, but someone still concealed within the city, where faces under fedoras blended seamlessly into the ceaseless flow of people. After formally eliminating the family as suspects, the police department decided to resume field searches on a larger scale, incorporating civilian volunteers to alleviate public pressure. One gray October morning, with cold wind from the Hudson River scattering dry leaves across the paths, Arthur Blake was assigned to lead an expanded search around Riverside Park and the abandoned buildings along the route from 95th to 110th Street. Nearly 200 people participated, including police, firefighters, park employees, and local residents. They were divided into small teams, each equipped with maps and radios, and advanced in lines, methodically sweeping designated areas. The riverbank was searched first, then expanded into dilapidated residential blocks and warehouse rows near the rail yard. Another team traversed the abandoned subway tunnel beneath 96th Street, using flashlights to probe damp, mold-encrusted crevices. The heavy air, thick with the stench of rust and refuse, required everyone to wear masks. Blake accompanied the main group, inspecting each boarded-up 2-story brick building. In one, they discovered a pair of child's shoes covered in dust, with cracked leather and broken laces. The team fell silent, exchanged glances, and promptly sealed and submitted the items for examination. When the results returned, the shoes were not James's. They were a full size larger. The information was kept confidential, but rumors spread, stirring a mix of hope and anxiety among the public. In the afternoon, a rescue team searched stairwells leading to utility tunnels where the homeless often took shelter. They found a small red sweater snagged on a metal pipe, but its label differed from that of the sweater James wore in family photographs. Every potential clue began with promise and swiftly dissolved into disappointment. Blake meticulously recorded findings in a log, marking searched areas in red ink, each square systematically eliminated from the operational map. As daylight faded, the search teams withdrew to the staging area to report. One officer reported finding ash and matchbooks in a basement near a warehouse, suggesting recent occupancy, but no indications of a child. Blake ordered the area sealed for further investigation. While speaking with the rescue coordinator, Elena arrived unexpectedly with her sister Alicia. Wearing heavy coats and visibly drained, they insisted on participating in the search. Though not permitted, Blake allowed them to accompany a supervised team in the park. The two women moved slowly along the grass paths, calling James's name into the wind. Their hoarse voices echoed in the empty, chilled space. The surrounding volunteers maintained silence, recognizing that no words of comfort would suffice. By the third day, the search expanded southward to the derelict shipyard buildings. Dozens of officers combed abandoned vessel compartments and scrapyards. A child's yellow raincoat was found caught on a fence, but its color did not match the case file description. Blake sighed and placed the item in an evidence bag. Returning to the staging area, he observed the exhausted searchers seated along the paths, clutching cold coffee cups. Several volunteers stated they would return the following weekend, but their eyes betrayed the ebbing of hope. On the evening of the fifth day, as stronger river winds lowered the temperature, the command post, consisting of tents erected beside a parking lot, was filled with maps covered in red crosshatches, indicating nearly every area within a 2-mile radius had been examined. Blake toured the tents, surveyed the fatigued faces, and ordered the operation terminated. The rescue coordinator recorded in the log, no traces of the victim or associated personal items were discovered. Those brief words concluded 5 days of relentless effort. That evening, police vehicles departed one by one, leaving only a few figures to remove barricade tape. Elena watched from a distance, clutching a crumpled poster. Light rain began to fall, blurring the lights along the riverbank. Blake approached, placed a hand on her shoulder, and stated that the search would not end entirely but was being paused for reassessment. His words, carried away by the wind, rang hollow. As the participants dispersed, the park returned to its prior stillness, with the sole difference that the once green lawns were now scarred by muddy boot prints and scattered remnants of evidence tape, the final vestiges of a search that yielded no results, and left behind only an expanding void in the hearts of all who had taken part. After the large-scale search operation concluded without results, the press began questioning the competence of the New York Police Department. A series of internal meetings followed, and under mounting public pressure, city officials decided to transfer the file on the disappearance of James Ramirez to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for coordinated oversight. A complete copy of all documentation, including crime scene photographs, maps, witness statements, and physical evidence, was sealed and delivered to the FBI's Manhattan field office in early November. Although Arthur Blake remained the lead investigator at the city level, he was now required to work with Harold Keating, the federal agent responsible for the Northeast region. Keating was a methodical investigator who spoke little and had worked on several interstate kidnapping cases. His calm demeanor differed markedly from the frenetic pace typical of urban police work. The first meeting between the two took place in a small room on the 8th floor of the federal building on 26th Street. The case file on James was spread out across the table. Black and white photographs of the park grass, the west gate, and the indistinct black Ford captured in the toll booth frame. Keating methodically turned the pages without visible reaction, making only brief notes. Vehicle unidentified. Person unidentified. Point of contact unidentified. After reviewing the file, he suggested comparing the case to similar child disappearances in the Northeast over the previous 3 years. The FBI had access to a broader database that included cases from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. A data analysis team was formed to examine more than 40 disappearances involving children between the ages of 3 and 6. Each case was evaluated based on 3 criteria: location, timing, and method of disappearance. The results showed that most cases occurred in sparsely populated residential areas or rural regions, not in the heart of a city, as with James. Cases involving abduction by motor vehicle were invariably linked to family members or acquaintances. The Riverside Park case shared no clear commonalities with them. Blake read the summary and felt as though all efforts had returned to square one. He asked Keating whether it was possible that the abductor was an interstate traveler who selected random victims to avoid identification. But Keating shook his head, stating there was no matching pattern of behavior. In other cases, suspects typically left some trace, a personal item, a threatening letter, or financial evidence, but here, there was nothing. At the end of the meeting, Keating concluded, "If someone took the boy, he knows exactly how to avoid leaving a trail." Following the meeting, Blake and his team were granted access to the FBI's National Crime Database. They compared the sketch of the man in the fedora with hundreds of photographs from old case files, ranging from suspects arrested in New York and New Jersey to fugitives in the Northeast. Images were projected one by one, but hours passed without any matches. One FBI agent remarked half-jokingly, "If he really exists, he must be the most ordinary man in the world." Blake did not respond and remained silent. In his report to the department, he wrote succinctly, "FBI confirms no subject matching the described characteristics exists in the federal database. No connection exists between the Riverside Park case and any contemporaneous child disappearances." Nevertheless, the file was classified as a long-term investigation, meaning it would be updated if similar cases arose in the future. In the days that followed, Blake and Keating met several more times to discuss the possibility that James had been transported out of state. They examined registration records for Ford vehicles in the New Jersey area, but the data yielded no better results than before. Occasional tips surfaced, individuals claiming to have seen a boy resembling James at a ferry terminal or in a store, but upon investigation, all proved to be mistaken identifications. The silence surrounding the case became its most unnerving feature. No trace evidence, no new witnesses, no ransom demands, no anonymous letters, only a perfect void. Keating told Blake that federal statistics indicated that for most abductions of young children, if the victim was not located within the first 72 hours, the chances of survival dropped sharply. Blake did not want to hear the numbers. He still believed James was alive somewhere, being held or transported far away. Before leaving the office, Keating stated that the case would be entered into the federal alert system for neighboring states, but he was frank. "Without new evidence, this file will soon sink." Blake understood, yet he sensed that something remained unseen. As he left the building, night had fallen, cold wind blew across the river, and the lights of the George Washington Bridge flickered in the fog. He looked toward it, the place where the indistinct black Ford had appeared in the toll booth frame, then turned away. The case no longer belonged solely to the city. It had been absorbed into a larger system, which also meant it was subsumed among hundreds of other missing persons files, waiting in the FBI's lengthy backlog, files that grew thicker by the day without ever being marked resolved. As the case appeared to reach a near standstill, a series of procedural errors gradually came to light, casting doubt on the entire initial investigation. Blake discovered the first irregularity during a routine review of case files, while checking the inventory of sealed evidence transferred from the Riverside Park scene to the department's storage facility. The original manifest listed items including a candy wrapper, shoe print photographs, a marked map, and a small bag containing green yarn fibers recovered from the grass near the wooden bench. However, when compared with the storage inventory, the bag of fibers was missing. The warehouse staff claimed they had never received a bag with that catalog number and suggested it might have been returned or misfiled. Blake did not accept this explanation. He examined the transfer manifest and found that the receiving signature for the yarn fibers did not match that of the duty officer at the warehouse. The trail ended with a faint notation on an old inventory sheet, sent to technical laboratory, yet the technical laboratory confirmed they had never received the sample. The yarn, the only physical evidence potentially linking an outsider or external object to the scene, had disappeared. Blake filed an internal report requesting an administrative inquiry, but his superiors dismissed it as a minor clerical error with no impact on the overall outcome. He felt powerless, knowing that timely analysis of the yarn might have identified its fabric type, origin, or manufacturer, and at least established that it did not belong to James. The second error emerged from the case documentation itself. During an FBI-requested review, Keating discovered that the initial report describing James's clothing at the time of his disappearance recorded blue wool sweater, brown shorts. However, all family and witness statements consistently described him as wearing a white shirt and blue shorts. Blake examined the original document and realized that the description had been mistyped. The word white had been erroneously changed to wool blue. This error had been propagated in the first wave of search bulletins and posters, causing potential sightings of a boy in a white shirt to be dismissed as non-matches. What had seemed a minor mistake now stood as evidence of imprecision in the investigative process. Blake presented the full extent of the discrepancies to his superiors. The commander sighed and said, "We handle hundreds of cases a year, mistakes happen." But to Blake, these were not mere mistakes but failures. He insisted on formally documenting the errors in the case file, arguing that if the investigation were reopened, these details would need to be known. Weeks later, the press learned of the missing yarn fibers and the clothing description error. A major newspaper ran a story headlined, "Police Blunders Leave James Ramirez Case at a Dead End." The question ignited a wave of sharp criticism. The Ramirez family read the article in silence. Elena sat motionless before the paper, her sunken eyes dry of tears. Carlos threw the newspaper onto the table and quietly said they had placed their trust in the wrong people. For the first time since his son's disappearance, he declared he wanted to hear nothing more about the police. Alicia attempted to explain that Blake was still working on the case, but her reassurances rang hollow. Word spread through the neighborhood, with residents saying the police had done nothing but make mistakes. In the office, Blake was summoned to an emergency meeting. His commander instructed him to limit direct contact with the press and refrain from discussing procedural errors to avoid damaging the department's reputation. He nodded without comment. Returning to his desk, he looked at the worn case file, filled with dozens of pages of overlapping documents containing misspellings, faded numbers, and an empty space where the yarn fibers should have been. He understood that everything they had done in the preceding months might have been compromised from the outset by small overlooked details. That evening, he stopped by the Ramirez home. Elena did not come to the door, only Alicia appeared. She said quietly, "My sister doesn't want to speak with the police anymore." Blake stood silently, making no attempt to persuade her. He left his business card on the vestibule table and walked away. As he returned to his car, he looked up at the second-floor apartment window, where a faint light spilled out and the silhouette of a thin woman sat by the door. Her gaze fixed on the distant park. In his mind, the sound of a typewriter erroneously converting white to wool blue echoed like a verdict. That mistake, combined with the vanished yarn fibers, had not only undermined the investigative record, but had also eroded the last remnants of trust held by a family that had already lost everything. Amid the mounting errors and the collapse of the Ramirez family's faith in the investigation, a new lead emerged from an unexpected quarter. In January 1956, a young records officer in the New York Police Department's archival section, Thomas Greer, came across a federal bulletin while conducting a routine inventory review. The bulletin reported irregularities in adoption records in Pennsylvania and was circulated to regional agencies to assist in checking potential links to child trafficking operations. Greer skimmed the document and paused at a footnote stating, "Several children are recorded as orphans with unknown parents, but no evidence exists of their place of birth or originating welfare agencies." He immediately thought of the James Ramirez case due to the matching time frame and brought a copy to Arthur Blake. Blake was initially skeptical, as adoption records were typically under state jurisdiction. But when Greer presented a list of 8 cases with notable similarities, children aged 3 to 5 adopted in October or November 1955, all listed with the source as a private charitable organization, he began to take notice. What troubled them was that none of the records included verification signatures from state welfare agencies or original medical files. Many contained only the adoptive parents' names, rural Pennsylvania addresses, and a scrawled entry in the child's information section, orphan, no parents. Blake contacted the Pennsylvania State Welfare Office for verification. 3 days later, they received confirmation that the state had no legitimate records corresponding to any of the 8 cases. An unnamed welfare office employee explained that in recent years, numerous self-proclaimed charitable intermediaries had collected children from large cities, particularly New York and New Jersey, and arranged adoptions without undergoing standard verification procedures. These organizations operated covertly, accepting donations from families seeking to adopt. Blake was stunned. The first thought that struck him was the possibility that James had been funneled into such a network, separated from his parents, and falsified into records as an orphan. With Greer, he compiled a list of the adoptive parents named in the documents, 6 married couples, and 2 single individuals scattered across small towns such as Scranton, Allentown, and Reading. Local police were asked to assist with verification. Preliminary results, a week later, showed 4 cases untraceable, addresses did not exist, or the adoptive parents had relocated. In 3 other cases, adoptive parents confirmed having received children, but claimed they had done so through a church intermediary and knew nothing of the children's origins. One case drew particular attention, the records of a middle-aged couple in Carbon County who had taken in a 4-year-old boy in late October 1955, just 2 weeks after James's disappearance. The paperwork listed the child's name as Ethan, with no surname or birthplace, only the notation placed by the Grace Mission organization. When Greer inquired about this organization, the state responded that no legally registered charitable entity by that name existed in its records. Blake brought the report to FBI agent Keating and proposed expanding the investigation at the federal level. He argued that if the Grace Mission truly existed, James's disappearance could be part of an illicit interstate adoption network beyond local jurisdiction. Keating listened carefully, but cautioned that more concrete evidence would be required before pursuing a federal inquiry. He noted that the FBI could intervene only when there was clear evidence of interstate activity. Blake countered that the records themselves constituted evidence. 8 children of indeterminate origin from New York, appearing in Pennsylvania records at the same time, could not be coincidental. The meeting concluded with an agreement that the FBI would search its national database for any legally operating or previously investigated organization named Grace Mission. A week later, the results came back. No such records existed. The Bureau identified 2 charitable organizations with similar names in Chicago and Boston, but neither had any connection to Pennsylvania. This only heightened the likelihood that Grace Mission was a front. Meanwhile, the NYPD's internal report on the James case was updated to include the new line, possible removal of victim from state via illicit adoption network. This information was not released publicly, but it quickly circulated within investigative circles. Some veteran officers dismissed it as Blake's attempt to prolong a stalled case, but younger officers, including Greer, believed they had touched upon something substantial. Blake formally requested coordination from the FBI's Philadelphia field office, enclosing the full set of questionable adoption records. In the accompanying memorandum, he wrote, "Recommend expansion of federal investigation. Hypothesis of an illegal intermediary network specializing in transporting children across state lines, disguised as humanitarian activity." As he signed the proposal, the images of Riverside's grassy bank and the black Ford faded from his mind, replaced by blank sheets of paper bearing the cold, empty notation, "Orphan parents unknown," as though James's fate had been rewritten with a few strokes of a pen on fraudulent documents. The report proposing the existence of an illicit adoption network, submitted by Arthur Blake, sparked intense debate within the New York Police Department. Shortly after the document reached command offices, an emergency meeting was convened to discuss the direction of the investigation. The meeting room was crowded and thick with cigarette smoke, with competing voices filling the space. A group of younger investigators, led by Thomas Greer, argued that the Pennsylvania adoption records listing children of unknown origin represented a genuine lead, that James's disappearance was merely the visible tip of a larger interstate child relocation network. They cited the matching timelines, the phantom charitable organizations, and statements from state welfare officials. The opposing faction, consisting of veteran officers, maintained that it was all coincidence. They pointed out the absence of physical evidence, placing James outside the state, the lack of witnesses to any handoffs of children, and the implausibility of attributing a single park abduction to a child trafficking conspiracy. "We can't turn one stalled case into a nationwide anti-trafficking crusade just because we've hit a dead end," one officer stated. The atmosphere grew tense as Greer attempted to elaborate, but was repeatedly interrupted, while Blake listened silently to the arguments. He understood that the issue extended beyond investigative direction to questions of budget and manpower. Following the failed search, departmental resources were being curtailed, and other active cases required personnel. The superiors were blunt. "This case has dragged on too long without results and lacks sufficient basis for continued priority." At the meeting's conclusion, Blake was informed that File NY-55, 2041 would be downgraded to low priority, meaning it would no longer receive dedicated investigative attention. Other detectives would be reassigned to a new homicide in Brooklyn, while Blake and Greer would retain only a supervisory role over the file. The decision was tantamount to a quiet death sentence. That afternoon, the case assignment board in the squad room was updated. James's case was moved to the bottom of the list, alongside files that had languished for years without progress. Greer reacted with frustration, slamming a stack of papers onto a desk and declaring that they were abandoning their only real chance at a breakthrough. An older officer replied coolly that if the FBI had found nothing, there was little reason to expect different results from them. Blake intervened to halt the argument, though he knew persuasion was futile. In the days that followed, an unnatural quiet settled over the office. Maps once covered in red annotations were rolled up and stored. The sketch of the man in the fedora was removed from the wall and replaced with paperwork from another case. Federal files and correspondence from Pennsylvania were bundled together and stamped "Investigation Suspended." Greer continued to bring Blake occasional reports each morning: disappearances in Trenton, a girl taken from a Newark church, all aligning with the same time frame, but Blake could only read them and file them away. He was not authorized to pursue new investigative threads based on an unproven hypothesis. During weekly briefings when the James Ramirez case was mentioned, the commander's response was brief: "No progress, maintain status quo." By month's end, an official order was issued. The Riverside Park Investigative Unit was disbanded. All evidence and documentation would be transferred to the Central Storage Facility in Queens. Blake signed the transfer manifest, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the phrase, "transfer to archives," as though it were a silent condemnation. That evening he remained in his office late, opening the file for one final review. The park photographs, riverbank images, wooden bench, and missing child flyers lay there as remnants of an unfinished effort. He recalled Keating's earlier words, "Without new evidence, this file will soon sink." Now that had come to pass. Greer entered and asked quietly, "Are we really stopping?" Blake did not answer immediately, saying only, "Sometimes, belief alone is not enough." The following morning, the box containing file NY-55, 2041, was sealed, labeled "Cold Case," and removed by records personnel. Those in the unit watched in silence as it was carried away. No one spoke. Outside the window, snow began to fall lightly, dusting the steps of police headquarters with a thin white layer. Inside, the chill was no less palpable. From that moment, the disappearance of James Ramirez was no longer an active investigation. It became just another file stacked among hundreds of others, forgotten amid stacks of yellowed documents and unresolved disputes among those who wore the same uniform but no longer shared the same conviction. When the case was officially deprioritized and the files were transferred to storage, the police silence once again provoked an explosion in the media. With no official information left to report, The press began reconstructing the story in their own terms. The front page of the New York Chronicle carried the bold headline, "The Riverside Case, Police Giving Up or Family Hiding Something." The accompanying two-page article quoted an unnamed inside source, claiming that inconsistencies in the mother's statements had raised suspicions in the investigation. Although these claims were never verified, they rapidly spread across other local papers, reigniting doubts that had previously been quelled. Tabloids reprinted old photographs of Elena, taken while distributing flyers, maliciously captioning her weary expression, "The cold emotions of a mother." Carlos was referred to as the rarely seen father, while Aunt Alicia was described as the only one who persistently searched, but with her own peculiarities. As public opinion was steered, the once familiar West Side neighborhood turned cold. Neighbors who had previously helped post flyers now avoided the family. Some even remarked that there was something sinister about that apartment. Children in the neighborhood were told by their parents not to play near the Ramirez home. At the laundry where Elena worked, customers began to dwindle, and her boss advised her to take some time off to let things settle. When Carlos returned to the shipyard, he overheard colleagues whispering that the police still suspected him. No one said it outright, but their glances choked him. The second-floor apartment, once filled with James's laughter, now contained only the ticking of a clock and heavy breathing. Alicia continued writing letters to newspaper editors to refute the stories, but only a few minor publications printed them before they were buried in the torrent of information. Whenever she went out, people watched her. Not with sympathy, but with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Meanwhile, the NYPD came under attack from both sides. The public criticized the police for failing to protect a child, while the press implied the department was concealing procedural errors to save face. The police commissioner held a press conference to reassure the public, but his statement, "We did everything we could," only fueled greater frustration. A group of Manhattan parents launched a petition demanding an independent investigation into the Riverside case. Gathering over 1,000 signatures, the city council was forced to convene an emergency meeting, but its final conclusion remained vague. No clear criminal misconduct was found. Public trust in law enforcement eroded. Major newspapers exploited these contradictions to sell papers. The Evening Post ran the headline, "If your child goes missing, who will the police believe, you or themselves?" That question haunted hundreds of families with young children, leading many to keep their children at home rather than letting them play in parks. At police headquarters, Blake was summoned to explain the information leaks. He insisted he had not spoken to the press, but he was still reprimanded. His superiors ordered him to cease all contact with the victim's family and maintain silence. For Blake, this was the final blow to his efforts. When he went to 108th Street to return some documents to Elena, she had locked the door and refused to see anyone. Through the glass, he saw only the silhouette of the thin woman sitting at the table with a newspaper spread before her. Outside, a group of children played, their laughter echoing sharply in the narrow courtyard. He left without knocking. That evening, a local television news program aired a special report. 1 year after the Riverside disappearance, no one charged, no one held accountable. The final shot showed an empty wooden bench in the deserted park, beneath a street lamp. While the public watched and passed judgment, the Ramirez family sank into absolute silence. Elena barely spoke, Carlos drank more, and Alicia moved in with her sister to provide care. Each morning, they still opened the window overlooking the river, where sunlight glinted on the water, but no one believed anything would change. In the city at large, the name James Ramirez became a symbol of police failure, a story each person retold in their own way, no longer concerned with the truth, only with feeding a need for anger and suspicion. Newspapers and street conversations had unwittingly buried that small family beneath a thick layer of prejudice, isolating them completely in the very city they had once believed was the safest place for their child. 18 months after James's disappearance, the Riverside case was officially classified as a cold case. The decision was issued on a damp April morning in 1957, when the entire NY55 2041 file was sealed and loaded onto a truck bound for the NYPD's Central Records Warehouse in Queens. Arthur Blake was present as warehouse staff placed the heavy cardboard box on a steel shelf and affixed a red unsolved label. No one spoke, there was only the harsh clang of the metal door closing. From that moment, the case was removed from active investigation, and the name James Ramirez existed only in official paperwork. Outside, the press largely lost interest, but in the West Side neighborhood, that silence carried more weight than any clamor. The Ramirez family could scarcely recover after 2 years of scrutiny and despair. Carlos, always a man of few words, grew increasingly withdrawn and distant. He quit his job at the shipyard, saying he could no longer bear his colleagues' pitying stares, and one morning he packed a few clothes, left for the South, and provided no forwarding address. Elena learned of his departure only when the landlord called to say he had vacated his room. After her husband left, she rarely left the apartment. The long days passed in silence, with the windows always closed and the curtains drawn day and night. The sound of the nearby church bells each Sunday morning made her weep because James had loved to hear them. The family doctor diagnosed her with severe depression and prescribed sedatives, but she rarely took them, fearing she would lose the last remnants of feeling. James's room remained untouched, the small bed covered with a thin blanket, a photograph of the smiling boy hanging on the wall, a print Alicia had made from an old roll of film, now faded with time. The once young aunt became the sole support, keeping the household from complete collapse. Alicia continued her seamstress job, using her earnings to print more flyers and send letters to radio stations in neighboring states. Inquiring about unidentified missing children, she clipped every small news item about nameless boys, pasting them into a notebook where she compared faces, birth years, and builds. Sometimes she went to bus depots or ferry terminals, simply to watch the children passing through, wondering if one might be James. Neighbors felt sympathy, but kept their distance, unsure what to say. When they encountered Alicia in the hallway, they merely nodded and hurried away. At the precinct, the case was relegated to the bottom of the tracking list and no longer mentioned. After being transferred to another unit, Blake kept a copy of James's photograph in his desk drawer. Though he no longer had access to the file, whenever he passed the Queens warehouse on assignment, he would pause before the rows of dust-covered boxes stacked high, wondering how many cases like James's were buried there, children forgotten amid a sea of numbers. Once he received a handwritten letter from Alicia, addressed to the precinct, asking whether the police still retained the sketch of the man in the fedora. He replied briefly that all evidence had been sealed and was inaccessible. But in his mind, he remembered that composite more clearly than anyone. Meanwhile, Elena grew ever more withdrawn. Neighbors reported that each afternoon she would drag a wooden chair to the window and sit staring down at the street where the neighborhood children played. Once Alicia found her sitting motionless for 3 hours, murmuring her son's name. She knew she could not pull her sister back to normal life and could only remain silently by her side. That winter, when snow blanketed the neighborhood, Elena hung a small stocking by the window, as she had every Christmas before, but it contained no gifts, only a card written in a trembling hand. "If you can read this, I am still here." Alicia folded the card and stored it in a drawer with the unsent letters and yellowed newspaper clippings. Outside, the city changed day by day, new cases crowded the front pages, and the story of the boy who vanished from Riverside Park faded into an old anecdote. No one remembered the precise timeline, only that it was a long time ago. But in that second-floor apartment, time was permanently suspended at noon on that October day in 1955. The day everything shattered. When Alicia lit a memorial candle on the second anniversary of the disappearance, its small flame flickered in the photograph's glass, illuminating the boy's smile. She whispered, "We have never forgotten you." Knowing that even if all the files were closed and the rest of the world had stopped searching, a part of James lived on in the memories of the two women who remained in that city, where everything could be forgotten, except a loss that never faded. In October 1955, in a small town in Carbon County, Pennsylvania, the couple Walter and Martha Hensley brought a 4-year-old boy into their home. They introduced him to neighbors as Ethan Miller, an orphan whose parents had died in a car accident in New Jersey. No one pressed for details, as the town was quiet and its residents kept to themselves. Walter, a taciturn machinist known for his strictness, and Martha, a gentle, devout woman who had long yearned for a child without success, lived in an isolated house on a dirt road leading into a small wood. The weathered metal-roofed home had a front porch adorned with wind chimes and pots of mums. Neighbors recalled the morning they brought the boy home. It was chilly, with mist cloaking the fields. Martha carried the child wrapped in a brown wool blanket, while Walter walked ahead, holding a small suitcase. No one saw anyone hand the boy over to them. They were simply told that a church acquaintance had facilitated the adoption. Ethan quickly became part of the household, but their life was always shrouded in a layer of silence. The boy was rarely allowed outside the yard, received no formal schooling, and was taught to read and write by Martha at home. They claimed his health was fragile, and that he was prone to illness, making it unwise for him to mix with others. Occasionally, neighboring children saw him peering out from behind a window, round-faced with large, dark eyes, but when they waved, he retreated into the shadows. In the early years, no one in the town knew exactly where Ethan had come from. Walter vaguely explained that a priest had introduced them to the child, and that the adoption papers had been signed through a charitable organization called Grace Haven. He produced a birth certificate stating Ethan Miller, born Philadelphia, 1951. Though the seal was faint and the issuing authority unclear. In a small town, no one inquired further. People assumed it was simply a case of good people taking in an orphan. Ethan grew up under a rigid routine. Walter enforced precise schedules for waking, eating, studying, and sleeping, and the boy was never permitted outside without explicit permission. Martha was gentler, reading from the Bible each evening, stroking his hair, and telling him, "God sent you to me." But on rainy nights, Ethan would wake from strange dreams, the sound of rippling water, distant laughter, and the image of a wooden chair in a green expanse. When he asked his adoptive mother about them, she would smile and say, "Those are the memories of an angel before coming to earth." He accepted this until he grew older. Whenever strangers came to the house, utility workers or delivery men, Walter positioned himself near the door, watching with a cold stare and ensuring Ethan had no contact with them. Martha rarely took him to church services, listening instead via radio. Though they lived in a small community, the Hensley family remained almost entirely isolated. People said Walter disliked prying eyes and had once quarreled with a neighbor for asking too many questions. In the backyard, Walter built a small shed that served as his workshop and kept it locked all day. Ethan was forbidden to enter, but he often saw his adoptive father cleaning old wooden boxes containing papers and miscellaneous items, a picture frame, a broken clock, a fountain pen, objects that did not belong to the family. When asked, Walter would say, "They're just things other people left behind." On the surface, life passed quietly, but from the age of 4 and then 6, the boy sensed that he was somehow a stranger in his own home. He remembered nothing before arriving there, knew no true name, and was never told about his biological parents. Whenever he asked, Martha would reply, "The past doesn't matter. What God wants is for you to live well today." Ethan obeyed and trusted her, but sometimes, looking in the mirror, he felt his face bore no resemblance to anyone else in the household. The walls held photographs only of adults. The sole image of him as a young child was a 5th birthday portrait taken by Martha and placed in a silver frame. The few visitors, acquaintances of Walter's from neighboring towns, never mentioned the boy. Once, a neighbor jokingly asked, "Who does the kid take after, Walter?" He merely smiled and replied curtly, "He looks like he's supposed to." After that, the entire town understood it was best not to ask further. That summer of 1957, when Ethan was 6, Martha enrolled him in 1st grade. His teacher described him as well-behaved but quiet, with a startled reaction to loud noises such as car horns or raised voices. During art class, he frequently drew rivers, parks, and a dark-haired woman smiling at him. When asked who she was, he replied, "My mother, but not this mother." The teacher was briefly unsettled, but dismissed it as childish imagination. At school, Ethan had few friends and often sat alone, gazing out the window. One day, when Martha came to pick him up, another mother remarked, "Your boy is so sweet. Where did you adopt him from?" Martha simply smiled and said, "From a place far away." When she recounted the exchange at home, Walter frowned and suggested the boy should not attend school. After an argument, Martha persuaded him to allow half-day sessions. From then on, Ethan existed between two worlds, the classroom and daylight outside, and the silent house where the past was kept concealed. No one in Carbon County knew that the dark-haired boy had once borne another name, and that a family had once searched for him in a distant city. In his hazy memory, Ethan retained only one image, a blue sky over a park and a hand holding his own, before everything dissolved into silence. Time passed, and Ethan grew up amid the unchanging landscape of the small Pennsylvania town, where long winters and red dirt roads seemed eternal. At 17, he began to recognize the peculiarities in what had seemed an ordinary life. When the high school required medical records for graduation preparation, he asked his adoptive mother about his vaccination history. Martha hesitated briefly, then said it had probably been lost long ago and was unnecessary. But when he visited the school nurse, a check of state records revealed no trace of an Ethan Miller among patients vaccinated in Carbon County or surrounding areas. "You may have arrived here late," she said, "but there should be records from your place of birth." Ethan returned home with a heavy feeling. That night, after Walter was asleep, he searched his adoptive parents' filing cabinet. In the bottom drawer, among old bills, church letters, and their marriage certificate, he found a copy of his birth certificate. The yellowed paper bore a faint seal and handwritten text, "Ethan Miller, born March 14, 1951, Philadelphia." The birthplace field listed only a private birthing room with no hospital name. What caught his attention was that the certifying physician's signature appeared to be reproduced in printed ink, without the indentations of a pen. Under light, the paper's edges showed faint creases, as if it had once been pasted and peeled apart. In the lower left corner, another obscured and partially erased seal was barely visible. Ethan held the document for a long time, sensing he had touched something forbidden. The next day, he asked his adoptive mother, "Where was I born, exactly?" "Philadelphia." Martha looked up from the table, her face paling slightly. "Yes, you were born there, but I don't remember the hospital. It was a long time ago. You were very young." The answer seemed plausible, but her trembling voice drew his attention. From that point, Walter's gaze toward him changed, suspicious and probing. He began locking the backyard workshop more carefully and kept him at a greater distance. One night, Ethan overheard them arguing in low voices. Martha insisted, "He has a right to know the truth," while Walter countered that the truth would only make things worse. Heavy footsteps followed, then silence. The subject was never raised again in the household. That summer, Ethan took a part-time job at the town library. While sorting old magazines, he came across a brief 1955 article, "Boy Missing in New York, James Ramirez, 4, wearing white shirt, curly black hair." The description made his heart race. Though the black and white photograph was grainy, something in the child's eyes felt familiar, as if staring into a mirror. That night, he lay awake, his mind filled with overlapping images. A park, a wooden bench, the sound of water, and a faint calling voice. The next morning he showed the article to Walter, who glanced at it and tossed it onto the table, declaring firmly, "Don't put stock in old stories. The world is full of garbage news." When Ethan pressed further, Walter's eyes hardened, and he fell silent. But from that day he could not stop thinking. Why did his adoptive parents always evade questions about the past? Why was the birth certificate seal so indistinct? And why did he have no memories before the age of 4? Whenever he tried to recall earlier events, only vague images surfaced: sunlight on rippling water, the distant sound of a horn, and an unfamiliar hand grasping his own. As he grew older, the void in his memory increasingly unsettled him. When applying to college, he needed original documents to complete his records. At the State Vital Records Office, he submitted the birth certificate copy. The clerk examined it and said quietly, "This document is invalid. The signature and seal do not match the standard templates for 1951. When asked if he had the original, he said he did not know. Ethan left the building in a daze. That evening, he confronted Walter and Martha, demanding the truth. Walter sat in silence, gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Martha began to cry, saying, "Everything was done out of love for you." He stood abruptly and cut her off. "This ends here." Then he went to the workshop. Ethan could not sleep. The wind rattling the windows echoed their words. A conflicting sense rose within him. Gratitude for those who had raised him, mingled with fear that his entire life might be a fabrication. Days later, he tried contacting Philadelphia hospitals listed as private birthing facilities, but none had records for an Ethan Miller. A clerk at one remarked, "Years ago, there were some children's records added, and then quickly withdrawn. Could have been private adoptions." That statement unlocked a cascade of suspicions. Ethan hung up the phone, examined the birth certificate again, and knew with certainty that everything about his origins was false. In the house that had once been a refuge, the walls now seemed to close in. He began recording everything he knew in a notebook: dates, the organization called Grace Haven, fragmented memory details, his mother's words, his father's glances. Each entry was a piece of a picture he was not yet ready to see in full, but he understood that once he began writing it down, he could no longer retreat to the false security of ignorance, for the questions about his true identity, once raised, would never cease. After discovering the falsified birth certificate and finding no hospital records under the name Ethan Miller, his suspicions hardened into an unrelenting obsession. He could no longer concentrate on school. His thoughts constantly returned to the faded black and white image from the library newspaper, the photograph of a 4-year-old boy who disappeared in New York in 1955. One afternoon, he returned to the county library and obtained permission to access the basement newspaper morgue. The room smelled of old paper and dust, its yellow light spilling over long rows of steel file cabinets. He threaded microfilm reels, which whirred softly as they turned. After nearly an hour, he found the original article. Dated October 9, 1955, it was headlined, "4-year-old boy mysteriously vanishes from Riverside Park." He enlarged the image, his pulse pounding. The boy in the photograph wore a white shirt and had curly black hair, his small smile innocent. The eyes sent a chill through him, as if he were seeing a miniature version of himself. He traced his finger over the screen and read the caption. James Ramirez, son of Carlos and Elena Ramirez, disappeared from Riverside Park in Manhattan on October 2nd. The name echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. "James," he whispered it, the sound both alien and familiar. That evening, Ethan did not go straight home, but sat for hours in the town park, watching lamplight reflect on the pond and contemplating the uncanny coincidence. He told no one, not even Martha. In the following days, he sought every means to learn more about the disappearance. He wrote to the New York Chronicle, claiming to be a student, researching child abduction cases. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived with a photocopy of another article from April 1957, reporting that the Riverside case has been closed with no trace of the victim found. It noted that the Ramirez family has left the West Side without providing a forwarding address. He searched for further mentions of relatives or prior residences, but the piece ended with a single line. The mother, Elena Ramirez, still believes her son is alive. That statement caught in his throat. For the first time, he considered the horrifying possibility that the woman who still believed her son was alive might be his biological mother. That night, lying in bed, he recalled childhood dreams, a park, a wooden bench, a woman's voice calling a name on the wind. Perhaps the name he had half heard was not Ethan, but James. The next morning, he resolved to dig deeper. At the library, he searched old New York telephone directories for the surname Ramirez. There were dozens of listings, but none matched the addresses mentioned in the articles. He tried calling several numbers, but they were all disconnected. A telephone company employee explained that many lines from the West Side had been terminated in the 1960s. Undeterred, Ethan went to the county courthouse to request adoption records. The records custodian looked at him with surprise and asked whose parents he was inquiring about. Upon hearing the names Walter and Martha Hensley, the man checked the registers and said, "There is no registered adoption under those names." When Ethan asked if he was certain, the man replied, "Yes, if it was a legal adoption, the state would have a confirmation on file." The ground seemed to drop away beneath him. On the drive home in pouring rain, he pulled over, opened his small notebook, and recorded every detail. The birth certificate, the missing seals, the absent records, the newspaper articles, the name Ramirez. The pieces were beginning to connect, though without a clear shape. When he arrived home, Walter was sitting in the living room, smoking. He looked at his son coolly and asked, "Where have you been today?" Ethan replied vaguely that he had been at school. Walter nodded and said deliberately, "Don't dig up things that are buried. Some things are kept hidden for good reason." Ethan did not respond, but went to his room. The words sent a shiver down his spine. Late that night, after the house was quiet, he took the newspaper clippings and notebook out to the backyard and sat under the dim moonlight. He stared at the line. James Ramirez, missing 1955, and knew he could not dismiss the intuition. The next day he wrote to the New York Police Department, inquiring about access to the Riverside Park case file for criminological research. A month later the reply was succinct. "The file is archived at the Queen's Warehouse and is not open to the public." He read the words repeatedly, his chest tightening. Every avenue appeared blocked, yet the prohibition only reinforced his conviction that something had been deliberately concealed. Weeks later, Ethan visited Bill Carter, an old friend of Walter's, who worked as a mechanic in a neighboring town. Carter was drunk and rambling, but when Ethan mentioned 1955, he chuckled hoarsely. "I remember, that year Walter came back from New York, talking about a gift from God." Ethan sat frozen. When he returned home, he opened his notebook and added a final line. "If the person I truly am is not named Ethan, there is only one way to find out, by returning to where the story began." Beneath the lamplight, he studied the old photograph of the boy in the article. The eyes were identical to his own, and in that moment, he knew with certainty everything in his life, his name, his memories, his family, was not real. While Ethan Miller lived a life under a borrowed identity in Pennsylvania, in New York, the Ramirez family, the survivors of the 1955 nightmare, quietly clung to a fragile hope that their missing son had not died. After Carlos left, Elena lived with her sister Alicia until the end of her life. In 1960, Alicia married a Puerto Rican construction engineer and moved to Queens. 2 years later, she gave birth to a girl named Lucia, a name meaning light, as she said, to remind us that there is still something bright in this family. Lucia grew up in a home filled with faded old photographs, among tarnished frames depicting a dark-haired woman holding a 4-year-old boy, the person her mother never stopped mentioning. When Lucia was old enough to understand, Alicia told her the story of the nephew who vanished in Riverside Park, of the silent sister who waited for news every Christmas, and of the small stocking hung by the window that never received a gift. Lucia grew up haunted by that story. She became a nurse, married, and had children. But she maintained the habit of writing the name James on the church prayer list every holiday season. After Elena's death in 1989, Alicia kept all of her sister's belongings, the photograph frames, notebooks, a few old newspaper clippings, and missing person flyers. All were stored in a small wooden box secured with a key. In the early 2000s, as DNA technology began to be widely used for identification in criminal investigations, Lucia, then in her 40s, heard a radio program discussing the National CODIS database, where DNA samples from missing persons and their relatives are stored for potential future matches. The idea struck her like a bolt of lightning. If James were alive somewhere, a single match could reveal it. She discussed it with her mother, who hesitated, saying it has been too long, but eventually agreed. The two went to a small testing center in Queens that collaborated with the FBI to collect genetic samples. Lucia provided a blood sample, while Alicia supplied hair and nail clippings to represent the previous generation. The technician recorded the details: date of disappearance, year of birth, physical description. Lucia recited clearly: James Ramirez, born in 1951, missing in October 1955, at age 4. The person taking notes looked up at them, his expression softening briefly, and said, "We will enter the profile into the system. If there is any match, you will be notified." As they left, a light rain was falling, the streets slick with reflected light. Lucia held the receipt, feeling both relief and a lingering weight. She knew the odds of finding someone after nearly half a century were minuscule, but at least they had done what they could. For many years afterward, there was no response. Occasionally, Lucia called the center and was told only that the profile remains in the database with no matches. Each time, she forced a smile, thanked them, and hung up, her heart aching yet patient. Alicia aged quickly, and her health declined. But every morning she opened the old notebook with James written on the first page. "My sister's son is still alive," she told Lucia. "He may carry a different name, but his soul is still his." Lucia did not fully believe it, but could not refute it. After her mother's death, she brought the wooden box to her own home and placed it on a high shelf in the living room. She did not open it often, but on sleepless nights, she would sit and stare at it, thinking of the cousin she had never met. In the 2010s, as CODIS expanded and more states updated civilian genetic databases, allowing families of the missing to submit additional biological samples, Lucia, then in her 50s, decided to resubmit her profile to ensure the data was current. She provided a new DNA sample and signed a fresh consent form for sharing information with federal databases. The center staff told her, "The system is much more advanced now. If there is a match in the future, we will know immediately." Lucia thanked them, but she held only a faint hope, a habit ingrained over a lifetime. She no longer believed in miracles, but lacked the resolve to abandon the search entirely. Many urged her to put the past behind her, but whenever she watched her own son at play, she saw the dark eyes of the boy in the photograph, and that resemblance made forgetting impossible. One evening, while sorting through a cabinet, she found an old envelope her mother had sent to the police in 1973. Never answered. The writing was faded but legible. "Please do not forget the Riverside case. We are still waiting." Lucia returned the letter to the box, feeling a responsibility to preserve the flame of belief from the previous generation. Even if those around her had forgotten, even if the police had failed, she held one conviction: if there was even a slim chance to learn what had happened, whether finding bones or a living person, it was worth waiting for. She wrote a small note and taped it to the lid of the wooden box. DNA profile, CODIS, James Ramirez. That note became a reminder to everyone in the household that somewhere out there was a cousin who might have lived an entire life under another name. And though the hope was so faint, it was like a streak of light on the horizon. It was enough to keep that family, across 2 generations, from extinguishing the belief that the child from long ago might still be breathing the same air, simply never knowing where he belonged. In early 2015, 60 years after the disappearance at Riverside Park, an event that seemed entirely coincidental brought about the most significant turning point in a story long thought concluded. At that time, Ethan Miller's granddaughter, the daughter of his cousin on Martha's side, was a college student in Pittsburgh, working on an anthropology project involving genetics. Her professor required students to take a commercial DNA test to explore ancestral origins. The young woman, named Hannah, purchased an ancestry DNA kit online, and the sample was submitted as a minor academic exercise. 3 weeks later, her results appeared extended genetic communities, Puerto Rican, East Harlem, New York. Hannah was surprised, as her family had always believed the Hensley line was purely European. Scrolling to the relative matches section, she found a close family connection, sharing approximately 20% of DNA, with an account belonging to Lucia R. in Queens, New York. She had no idea who Lucia was, but the system suggested likely second cousin. Initially dismissing it as a system error, Hannah examined the details and saw that Lucia's profile, submitted in 2010, was flagged as sample related to missing person, with the description, searching for James Ramirez, missing since 1955. A chill ran through her. She showed the results to her mother, daughter of Martha's cousin, who said, "It's probably just a random match. No Hensleys have ties to New York." But Hannah did not let it go. She sent a message to Lucia through the system, politely asking, "I have received a genetic connection notification with your account. Are you aware of any Ramirez relatives who lived in Pennsylvania?" 3 days later, Lucia replied briefly, "I am searching for a missing cousin. If you believe there is a connection, please provide more information about your family." Hannah responded that her grandfather was Walter Hensley, who died in 1998, and her grandmother was Martha, who passed away in 2003. Lucia was silent for a week, then sent a longer message containing only a few lines. "If Martha was an adoptive parent, I may have found my cousin." Hannah brought the correspondence to Ethan. He was then 64, gray-haired but still robust, living alone in the old family home. When he read the name James Ramirez, he froze. The shock made his hands tremble so violently that he could not hold the paper. More than 40 years of suspicion, fragmented memories, suddenly cohered around those two words. He sat motionless for hours, then ordered a separate DNA test kit and followed the instructions himself. The saliva sample was sent in early March. While awaiting the results, he barely slept. He reread all his old notes and the Riverside disappearance articles he had collected, and for the first time, he allowed himself to admit that the boy in the photograph was truly him. 2 weeks later, logging into the account, he saw the notification, 100% match, parent-child relationship. Elena Ramirez, New York sample 1989. Accompanying it were secondary matches with Lucia.S account, and extended family matches with 4 other individuals from the Ramirez line. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The world seemed to contract around one stark truth: his real name was not Ethan Miller. Ancestry's system sent a confirmation report stating that his DNA sample matched a profile in the federal CODIS database under the name James Ramirez. Missing person DNA reference with a confidence level of 99.999%. Ethan did not know how long he sat at the computer, only that his hand shook and tears fell onto the keyboard. Afterward, he printed all the results, placed them in an envelope, and sent copies to the state police along with a handwritten letter stating that he believed himself to be the child abducted in 1955. The file was quickly forwarded to the FBI's Philadelphia field office, which handles long-term missing person cases. A week later, the assigned agent contacted him, confirming receipt of the match results and requesting further verification. The agent asked for documents proving his current identity. He provided copies of his birth certificate, driver's license, and tax records. "We will be in touch," the agent said. When he hung up, Ethan sat in silence, his mind swirling with thousands of questions. If he was James, what had happened? Why had he been taken? Who had done it? And why had his adoptive parents kept it secret until death? News of the match spread rapidly through the federal system. Lucia was contacted to confirm her sample and authorize data sharing. Upon hearing the news, she was speechless and wept. 60 years of waiting, and a single strand of DNA had returned what her mother had never dared believe could be found. Weeks later, a special FBI investigative team was assigned to reopen the Riverside Park case under the category of historical missing child case. From their Manhattan office, They requested verification from Pennsylvania authorities and gathered records pertaining to Walter and Martha Hensley. At the Carbon County Courthouse, old files were exhumed, brittle pages crumbling in the hands of archivists. No official adoption papers existed, but there was a copy of a birth certificate with an altered seal, exactly as Ethan had described. This was sufficient for the FBI to conclude that the entire Ethan Miller identity had been fabricated. They created a new file titled James Ramirez, Found Alive. In the following weeks, the FBI methodically verified every detail. All DNA results matched the 2010 CODIS profile submitted by Lucia without exception. Forensic experts affirmed there is no genetic doubt. Ethan Miller is James Ramirez, missing since 1955. This determination was relayed internally to the New York field office and then to the New York City Police Department, where the case had originated 6 decades earlier. On the same day, a confidential memorandum was sent to the regional FBI director. Identity of long-term missing victim confirmed. Federal kidnapping investigation required. When federal agents arrived at Ethan's home to deliver the official notification, he sat in his chair, eyes red, the former reserve gone from his demeanor. "So I really am James," he said quietly, as if doubting his own voice. The agent nodded and placed the stamped verification document before him. "We will need to ask a few questions about your memories, if you are willing." Ethan looked out the window, where a fine rain traced paths down the glass. "I don't remember anything," he replied, "except that I always had the feeling I once belonged somewhere else." In New York, Lucia received the call on the same day. When the voice on the other end said, "We have found your brother," she went still and had to sit down to keep from falling. 60 years of waiting. All the pain and loss and futile prayers were contained in that brief message. She wept as the investigator's calm voice continued. "Thank you. It is because of your family's DNA sample that this case has finally reached a resolution." Elsewhere, in the old house in Pennsylvania, Ethan opened a drawer and retrieved the only photograph he had from his early years. A 5-year-old boy in a white shirt, taken in the Hensley family garden. He placed it beside a printout of the 1955 newspaper photograph, the two faces eerily identical. As sunset filtered through the window, the images overlapped, past and present converging, and in that moment, he knew that the 60-year journey to uncover the truth had truly begun. After DNA results conclusively proved that Ethan Miller was James Ramirez, the Federal Bureau of Investigation formally reopened File NY-55-2041, a case that had been closed for more than half a century. The decision was authorized in June 2015 by the New York Regional Director and assigned to Special Agent Maria Velasquez, a senior investigator in the Cold Case Unit of the Violent Crimes Analysis Section. At 46 years old and of Puerto Rican descent, Velasquez had successfully resolved numerous long-term cases by combining archival document analysis with genetic data. Upon taking charge, she understood that this was not merely an investigation, but a dialogue between two eras, the manual record-keeping of 1955 law enforcement and the DNA technology capable of resurrecting truth from a single cell. On her first morning in the Manhattan office, she placed on her desk the original case file box, transferred from the Queen's archives, a thick cardboard container labeled in red ink. Unsolved Child Missing, NY-55-2041. Opening it released the musty scent of aged paper and dust. Inside were handwritten reports, crime scene photographs, park maps, and dozens of miscellaneous notes. She began reading each document carefully, annotating in pencil. One detail caused her to pause. In the report describing the victim's clothing, the original entry, white shirt, blue shorts, had been crossed out and overwritten in a different darker ink as blue wool sweater, brown shorts. The overwriting was bolder and firmer, suggestive of a different hand. At the page's edge were faint traces of manual erasure, likely done with a razor blade, a technique sometimes used by investigators of that era to make administrative corrections. Velasquez scanned the page using spectral imaging and sent it to the document examination laboratory. The results confirmed that the overwriting ink had been applied weeks after the original entry, after official descriptions had been released to the press. She noted, possible intentional alteration of the record to mislead the investigation. Continuing her review, she identified 2 other documents with mismatched signatures, one on a chain of custody form and another on a file transfer sheet. Both were attributed to L. Murphy, an administrative clerk in 1956, but the signatures more closely resembled pasted photocopies than original handwriting. Velasquez requested verification of original signatures from the New York City Police Department's personnel records of the period. While awaiting those results, she examined the final report by the lead investigator, Arthur Blake, whose name appeared repeatedly. His last entry, dated April 12, 1957, consisted of a single line, "No new evidence. File to archives." Below it was an case closed stamp. Research revealed that Blake had died in 1989 without surviving relatives, but a younger colleague, Thomas Greer, is still alive in his 80s, residing in a New Jersey nursing home. Velasquez contacted the facility, identified herself, and requested an interview. Greer agreed. 3 days later, she drove to meet him. In the small, sunlit room, overlooking a garden, the elderly man, white-haired and hoarse-voiced but clear-minded, closed his eyes briefly when Riverside Park and James Ramirez were mentioned, and sighed. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," he said. Velasquez asked what he remembered. Greer explained that he had believed at the time that the case involved an illegal adoption ring operating out of Pennsylvania, but the investigation had been deprioritized due to limited manpower. He recalled that a senior officer had ordered the clothing description in the record to be adjusted to match the version released to the media. "We knew it was wrong, but there was nothing we could do," he said, his clouded eyes fixed on the distance. When asked for the name of the officer who issued the order, he replied quietly, "Lieutenant Donnelly." But he retired shortly afterward, and no one heard from him again. Velasquez took careful notes and showed him a spectral scan of the altered report. With a trembling hand, he nodded. "Yes, that's the original that was changed. We kept a true copy, but it was later lost in storage." That statement confirmed her suspicions. Someone had interfered with the 1955 records, possibly to conceal something. Returning to her office, she drafted a report to headquarters. Original documents show evidence of manual tampering, potential internal manipulation during case closure. Concurrently, she requested a search of old personnel records for Lieutenant Donnelly. The results showed Patrick Donnelly, who had supervised administration in the Detective Division, retired in 1957 and died in 1974. However, his financial records revealed an unexplained deposit of approximately $8,000 in 1956, an unusually large sum for a police salary of that era. Velasquez suspected it could represent a bribe related to suppressing or altering records. To test this hypothesis, she traveled to Pennsylvania to examine records of an organization called Grace Haven, referenced in the falsified adoption papers. No official documentation existed, but in a 1954 local church directory, she found a small advertisement. Grace Haven Assistance for Orphan Children, contact Pastor J.L. Donnelly, Scranton, Pennsylvania. The surname matched. Velasquez felt a chill. A New York Police Department lieutenant named Donnelly, retired in 1957, appeared to be connected to an illicit interstate adoption network. She photocopied the directory page, filed it, and marked it in red. Direct link between NYPD and illegal adoption ring. The following day, Velasquez briefed a newly formed federal investigative team consisting of 4 members, 2 DNA analysts, 1 records examiner, and 1 field agent. They agreed on 3 priorities: verifying the origins of the tampered documents, locating descendants or witnesses connected to Donnelly, and investigating the full scope of the Grace Haven network through Northeast Regional Church records. Velasquez directed the team to begin compiling federal administrative records on adoption activities from 1950 to 1960 and to contact a Philadelphia Religious Archives Center to identify clergy named Donnelly from that period. As the team began sifting through thousands of pages, Velasquez spread out a 1955 map of New York City and, using a red pen, retraced James's presumed path from the Riverside Park entrance to the location of the last reported sighting of the black Ford. Beside it, she placed a current photograph of Ethan alongside the 1955 image of the missing boy. The facial similarity was uncanny. Speaking to herself, she said, "We owe this child 60 years of truth." In her October 2, 2015 report, she wrote, "File NY55, 2041, has been reopened with indications of internal tampering and involvement in an organized illegal adoption ring. Objective traced back from intermediaries to the individuals who directly received James Ramirez." At the report's conclusion, she signed her name with a firm hand and looked out over the changed cityscape 6 decades later. But in the rain-slick streets, glowing under amber lights, she knew the Riverside Park case, though long buried in dust, had never truly ended. It had simply awaited the right person and the right moment for the truth to be named once again. After Special Agent Maria Velasquez established the suspicious connection between Lieutenant Patrick Donnelly and the organization Blessing of Grace, the next phase of the investigation focused on identifying individuals who may have directly received children from this network. The name Walter Hensley, the deceased adoptive father of Ethan, quickly emerged from the list. Maria and the analysis team began examining his complete history of residences, finances, and vehicles dating back to the mid-1950s. Old tax records were retrieved from the Pennsylvania State Archives, along with insurance data and vehicle registration records provided by the Department of Motor Vehicles. Among the yellowed pages, they discovered the first piece of evidence that caused the entire team to pause. Walter Hensley had registered a black 1951 Ford Custom Line with license plate number 7H412, exactly matching the partial sequence provided by witness Robert Delaney in his 1955 report. This discovery left the team silent. Maria requested verification from a second source. The DMV provided an original copy of the registration, which showed the plate was issued on September 14, 1955, in Trenton, New Jersey, 3 weeks before the disappearance of James Ramirez. The registration address was not in Pennsylvania, but a temporary apartment on Amsterdam Avenue in New York, less than 2 miles from Riverside Park. Next to Walter's name was a second, faint but legible signature, P. Donnelly, registration verification. In the conference room, Maria placed the document on the table and addressed the group. "This is the link between Donnelly and the Riverside case. Hensley did not merely adopt through the network. He was in New York at the time of James's disappearance." The team expanded the investigation backward. They reviewed Hensley's employment and rental records and found that he had worked as a mobile mechanic for a police department repair shop where Donnelly had overseen maintenance. This overlap made the hypothesis of a covert alliance between the two men nearly certain. In October 1955, Hensley received payment for work in the Bronx and abruptly quit without explanation on October 3rd. One day after James disappeared, a week later, he withdrew his entire savings and purchased a small house in Carbon, Pennsylvania, the home where Ethan grew up. In Hensley's financial records, Maria identified a $8,000 wire transfer recorded as resettlement assistance. This amount corresponded to funds Donnelly had received in his own account that same year. Two sums, moving in opposite directions, originated at the same time. The FBI Financial Analysis Report concluded, "The probability that both funds originated from the same source is 94%. This suggested that Donnelly had received payment from an intermediary to arrange the transfer of the child and then passed a portion to Hensley, who served as the legal recipient. Maria decided to pursue further verification. She obtained a delayed search warrant from Carbon County Court to examine any remaining documents in Walter's estate. His sole surviving child, Ethan, consented to the FBI's access to the family safe. That day, Maria and two agents visited the old house where Ethan still lived. The workshop behind the house still smelled of machine oil, with everything preserved as it had been during his adoptive father's lifetime. Inside the rusted safe, they found a small wooden box containing old documents, receipts, handwritten letters, and a notebook in Walter's handwriting. The cover read, 1955, New York trip. Each page contained meticulous notes on routes, travel dates, and expenses for fuel, lodging, and meals. The entry for October 2nd read, Riverside, large park, met Donnelly's people. Child well behaved, did not cry. The terse, cold words cut like a knife. Ethan sat nearby, pale and speechless. Maria turned to the next page, which stated, Return to Trenton. Remember to change plates. Below it, in a scrawled hand, The Lord has granted me this opportunity. The notebook became decisive evidence. Together with the vehicle registration, it confirmed that Walter Hensley had been in New York at the time of James's abduction and had direct contact with Donnelly. The FBI crime laboratory examined the ink and paper, verifying an age consistent with the 1950s. The handwriting matched samples from Hensley's administrative records. The internal investigative report stated, physical and circumstantial evidence indicates that Walter Hensley transported the child James Ramirez out of New York in 1955 under arrangements made by Patrick Donnelly and the illicit adoption network. Blessing of grace. Maria continued searching for living witnesses. An elderly former neighbor of the Hensleys, Ruth Perkins, now over 80, confirmed, in an interview, that in the fall of 1955, she had seen a stranger arrive at the Hensley home, carrying a suitcase and a baby wrapped in a blanket. When asked, Martha claimed it was a relative's child. This account aligned with the notebook's description. From this evidence, the FBI reconstructed the sequence of events. Donnelly, as a lieutenant in charge of administration, had used his position to manipulate the missing persons file, altering clothing descriptions, tampering with reports, and removing evidence, before arranging to transfer the child to Walter Hensley, who worked at the police repair shop and was connected to him. In return, Hensley received a substantial sum of money and a fabricated legal identity for the child, shielded by the religious organization Blessing of Grace. The investigation also revealed that Donnelly had once lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the same region where Blessing of Grace was registered. Although both men were deceased, Donnelly in 1974 and Hensley in 1998, the evidence was sufficient to establish them as the central links in a nationwide illicit adoption ring operating under the guise of charity. In the 37-page report, submitted to FBI headquarters in Washington, Maria wrote, Walter Hensley, born 1915, is the primary suspect in the 1955 abduction of James Ramirez. Means employed, black Ford Custom Line, license plate 7H412. Accomplice, Lieutenant Patrick Donnelly, New York Police Department, who manipulated investigative records to conceal the crime. As she reviewed the final line, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. 60 years earlier, a child had been erased from the world by forged documents and lies from those sworn to uphold the law. Now, though delayed, justice had at least given the truth a form. In the quiet office, Maria removed the photograph of young James from the file and placed it beside a current photograph of Ethan, then added a handwritten final notation, primary suspect, deceased. Victim, survived. Case, reopened to close the circle. As she signed the report, her hand trembled slightly, for she knew that justice sometimes does not come from a courtroom, but from finally naming those who had once been deliberately forgotten. After concluding that Walter Hensley was the primary suspect, the FBI proceeded with the final phase of the investigation, a comprehensive search of his remaining property for physical evidence to bolster the case file. Special Agent Maria Velasquez personally obtained a warrant from Carbon County Court to examine an old storage area in the house, a small cellar behind the workshop that Ethan had described as always kept locked and strictly off-limits. In the fall of 2015, the investigative team arrived at the site early in the morning. The space was thick with the smell of metal and grease, its cracked concrete floor covered in heavy dust. As flashlight beams swept the walls, they located a rusted steel filing cabinet locked in place near the corner. A technician forced the lock, revealing dozens of brown paper-wrapped files, many unlabeled. All were sealed and transported to the FBI examination facility in Scranton for processing. 3 days later, the cataloging results left Maria stunned. Among the recovered documents was a cardboard box containing more than 10 photocopies of birth certificates, all dated between 1954 and 1956. Most lacking hospital codes or welfare agency validations. 3 certificates listed the place of birth as Philadelphia, private care home, matching the fictitious address Ethan had discovered on his own documents. Several showed erasures and alterations in the physician's signature section, notably, one birth certificate, dated October 10, 1955. 8 days after James's disappearance, named David Cole, born March 14, 1951, matching James's actual birth date. The handwriting and typewriter font were identical to those on the photocopy of the birth certificate, bearing the name Ethan Miller. Below it was a faint notation, "Blessing of Grace, file." The same box contained 5 old photographs of children aged 2 to 5, posed in the yards of various houses, without identification. On the margin of one, Maria discerned faint pencil marks under magnification, transfer to H. Scranton. These photographs provided clear evidence that Hensley had participated in an organized child trafficking network involving multiple children, not solely James. In addition to the files, the team found a small, cracked leather-bound diary belonging to Martha Hensley. It was written in a soft hand, interspersed with prayers and personal notes. The first entry, dated October 5, 1955, read, "Walter returned, bringing a baby with him. He said the Lord had answered our prayers." The child slept quietly in his blankets, looking frail and thin. I did not ask further. I only knew how long I had wanted a child. Subsequent entries chilled Maria. I heard talk of something terrible in New York, a missing child. Walter said it was rumor and told me to forget it. I wanted to believe him, but something kept me from sleeping. The final line on the page was a prayer. "If this child does not belong to us, may the Lord forgive us." Martha's diary continued intermittently for several years, providing sufficient evidence that she was aware of the child's illicit origin. Later entries shifted to a tone of resigned acceptance. "Then is good, like our own. We have lied, but perhaps we are making amends." Maria read every word, sensing the tragedy of a woman living with unspoken guilt. She had the entire diary photocopied and submitted to the forensics laboratory for dating. Analysis confirmed that the ink and paper were consistent with the period 1955-1960. The cabinet also held a sealed old envelope containing 5 receipts for hotels and gas stations along a route from New York to Trenton. One receipt, dated October 3, 1955, from Hudson Fuel Company on the outskirts of Manhattan, was signed by Walter Hensley, matching the diary's reference to return to Trenton. Based on this chain of physical evidence, Maria wrote in her report, "The documents demonstrate premeditated travel and acceptance of illicitly obtained children by Walter Hensley. The children were procured from New York through intermediaries, Patrick Donnelly, and the Blessing of Grace organization. Supporting evidence includes forged birth certificates produced in a concentrated period, travel receipts, unidentified child photographs, and a personal diary acknowledging the illicit origin." She added that Martha's diary evidenced indirect complicity, but also revealed the primary motive, an overwhelming desire for a child, combined with religious conviction and manipulation by her husband. That evening, Maria and the team sat in the office with the photographs spread across the table. They sat in silence, staring at the nameless faces of young children, children who may have been erased from their true lives by altered documents. One analyst said quietly, "James may not have been the only one." Maria nodded, her eyes fixed on the photograph marked E. Scranton. She knew there were other victims, but at least the first case had been solved. The following day, the team returned to the Hensley property to examine the ground behind the workshop, where Ethan recalled his adoptive father frequently digging. Forensic teams used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. Beneath the hard-packed earth, they detected a small void approximately 6 feet deep. Excavation revealed a rusted tin box containing damp, moldering paper documents, several handwritten letters addressed to Donnelly, a ledger listing 8 children's names and birth dates, with notations in an adjacent column. T. Transferred. E. Retained. Completed. At the top of the list was the entry JRT, October 2, 55. The handwriting matched Walter's. The analytical unit concluded that this was an internal ledger used to track child transfers within the network. Maria read it and felt a chill. 60 years later, every piece fit together: the black Ford, the man in the fedora, the Blessing of Grace network, the tampered reports, and the boy given the false name Ethan Miller. Each item recovered from the cellar was like a voice rising from the past, accusing a crime concealed under the guise of piety. In the 42-page report submitted to Washington, Maria wrote, "The search of the Hensley residence uncovered a secret archive documenting nationwide illicit child procurement." Evidence includes 1. A series of forged birth certificates produced over a concentrated period. 2. Unidentified photographs of children. 3. A personal diary documenting the acceptance of an illicitly obtained child. 4. An internal ledger consistent with the abduction timeline. She concluded, motive: desire for children, exploitation of religious belief, and coordination with empowered intermediaries in law enforcement to execute transactions disguised as humanitarian acts. As she closed the report, the late afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a pale gold glow across the desk. Outside, the old Hensley house stood isolated in the quiet town, as if it had never concealed the greatest secrets of half a century earlier. But now, everything had been exposed: the documents, the handwriting, the trembling prayers in the diary, all telling the same story: guilt, faith, and the consequences of a misguided love that had stolen a child from his rightful world. After completing the search of the Hensley residence and collecting all related documents, the FBI shifted its focus to scientific confirmation of the victim's identity to resolve the legal aspects of the case. At the FBI's genetic testing laboratory in Quantico, forensic experts conducted parallel comparisons across 3 separate systems: Ancestry DNA, where Ethan's initial sample had been uploaded in March; GED Match, an open database compiled by independent researchers; and CODIS, the official Department of Justice database containing DNA reference samples provided by the Ramirez family since 2010. The process was closely supervised by 3 independent forensic scientists to ensure no contamination or bias. Ethan's blood sample was divided into 3 separately coded aliquots. Analysis on Ancestry DNA produced a full match with the account of Lucia R. at the 25% level, consistent with a first-cousin relationship. The sample was then uploaded to GED Match, which automatically compared it to millions of civilian profiles. After 48 hours of processing, the result displayed full DNA match, parent-child relationship, sample ID 1951, RIVE, with a confidence level of 99.999%. Finally, the results were compared against CODIS reference samples, one from Elena Ramirez's hair retained since 1989, and another from a blood sample provided by Lucia in 2010, both showing a perfect match with Ethan's sample. The forensic laboratory concluded no genetic discrepancies. 3 independent systems confirmed the same result. Ethan Miller is the biological son of Elena and Carlos Ramirez. The 126-page report, signed by the chief of the FBI's Genetic Analysis Unit, was forwarded to Washington. Special Agent Maria Velasquez received the first copy on August 21, 2015. Upon reaching the final conclusion, she paused at length, then signed the verification block. DNA results valid, Victim identity confirmed. A second copy was sent to the FBI's Public Affairs Office to prepare for an official announcement. The following morning, a small press conference was held in a 12th-floor conference room at FBI headquarters in Manhattan. Attended by representatives from federal agencies, the New York City Police Department, and selected media. Maria presented the findings. She began in a calm but emotional tone. After 60 years, the 1955 disappearance of 4-year-old James Ramirez from Riverside Park has been solved through DNA technology and the persistent efforts of multiple generations of investigators. Behind her, a large screen displayed two photographs, one of the boy in 1955 and one of Ethan Miller in the present. The facial structure, features, and expression aligned strikingly. Maria continued. Independent analyses from 3 databases, Ancestry DNA, JD Match, and CODIS, demonstrate a genetic match of 99.999%. There is no remaining doubt Ethan Miller is James Ramirez. The room fell silent. Camera flashes erupted, reporters took notes, and several looked up at the screen in undisguised astonishment. When one reporter asked whether the case could now be considered closed, Maria replied deliberately, "The case has been resolved with respect to victim identification, but the investigation into the associated federal kidnapping remains active. We have identified the primary suspect as Walter Hensley, deceased in 1998, and his accomplice, former NYPD Lieutenant Patrick Donnelly. Although both are deceased, their criminal involvement will be formally documented." As the press conference concluded, the story spread rapidly across major news outlets. Headlines proclaimed 1955 cold case solved, missing boy found alive after 60 years. On online forums, thousands shared the story, describing it as a miracle of science and memory. In New York, Lucia received a direct call from the FBI office. The investigator's voice came over the line, "You can rest assured, the results have been confirmed. Your brother is alive." She fell silent, tears streaming down her face. 60 years of waiting, and all the prayers of her mother and Aunt Elena, had finally been answered. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, Ethan, now more precisely James, received a copy of the results by mail. The document was stark and impersonal, filled with cold numerical data, but to him, it was proof of his true existence. He read and reread the line, "Parent-child match. Elena Ramirez, 99.999%. In the quiet house, he placed the paper beside an old framed photograph, his eyes welling with tears. That evening, Maria visited. They sat at the wooden kitchen table in silence for several minutes. Finally, she said, "I have worked in this field for more than 20 years, but I have never seen a resolution like this. You are not merely a witness, you are living proof of the power of memory and science." James nodded and gave a faint smile. "And of love, because without them I would never have known who I am." Outside, an autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Maria looked at the man before her, silver-haired, with gentle eyes, shadowed by a stolen lifetime, and rose to leave, saying quietly, "From today, File NY55, 2041, will be officially closed with respect to victim identification. You can reclaim your name." As she departed, she glanced at the pale gray sky, knowing this moment would be recorded in history as one of the longest-standing cold cases fully resolved through DNA evidence. 6 decades, thousands of investigative hours, and countless individuals had converged to restore to a stolen child his identity, his history, and an irrefutable truth. After the official announcement confirming that Ethan Miller was James Ramirez, the FBI entered the most challenging and delicate phase of the case, preparing for the reunion between the victim and his biological family after 60 years of separation. This was no longer purely investigative work, but a complex psychological and humanitarian process requiring coordination among mental health professionals, media consultants, and federal security personnel. Special Agent Maria Velasquez, who had followed the case from the beginning, was designated as the primary coordinator. On August 24, 2015, she and two FBI staff members visited the small apartment of Lucia Ramirez in Queens. When Lucia opened the door and saw the familiar faces from prior phone calls, she understood that significant news had arrived. Maria smiled and placed an envelope on the table containing an official invitation from the federal agency. The first meeting between Lucia Ramirez and her brother James Ramirez is scheduled under the FBI's long-term victim reunification program. Lucia read the words slowly, her hands trembling and tears falling. In a quiet voice, she asked, "Does he know anything about us?" Maria nodded. "He knows, but we are assisting both parties in preparing before the meeting. 60 years is a vast gap, and we want to ensure that everything proceeds safely and with appropriate emotional preparation." Lucia looked out the window toward the faded photograph of James hanging on the wall, her voice shaking. "I never thought this day would come." Following that meeting, the FBI assembled a team of mental health specialists, led by Dr. Margaret Weller, an expert in long-term missing persons cases. The team developed separate preparation plans for James and the Ramirez family. For James, the focus was managing feelings of guilt and internal conflict. Having lived an entire life under a false identity, he now had to confront the reality of being a kidnapping victim. For Lucia, the preparation involved coming to terms with meeting a brother who was no longer the child of her memories, but a fully formed adult, carrying his own separate traumas. Dr. Weller met with James at the old Hensley house in Pennsylvania. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. He spoke sparingly, in a low voice, sometimes halting. "I don't know what I am supposed to feel," he admitted. "I know I am James, but I have lived as Ethan for so long. I don't want them to be disappointed if I am not the little boy they remember." Weller replied gently, "You do not need to be that little boy, you only need to be yourself, the man who survived." In her subsequent report, she noted, "Stable condition, with emotional disorientation, but acceptance of the facts. Recommend gradual contact through letters and photographs prior to an in-person meeting." Concurrently in New York, the specialists met privately with Lucia. They provided her with current photographs of James, a summary of his life, and guidance on possible emotional responses: shock, a sense of unfamiliarity, even disappointment. Holding a photograph of the silver-haired man with a kind smile but haunted eyes, Lucia wept. "I just want to hold him, even once," she said. Over the following 2 weeks, the FBI and psychological team developed a detailed plan for the reunion. The venue selected was a quiet community center in Forest Hills, Queens, near the neighborhood where the Ramirez family had lived in the 1960s. The space was configured for privacy, with 2 separate rooms, one for James to rest before the meeting, and another for Lucia and her family. No media were permitted to attend, only internal videographers were present to document the event for the case file. September 4th was set as the date for the meeting. During the preparation period, Maria maintained regular contact with James. She understood the profound ambivalence he carried, gratitude toward his adoptive parents, particularly Martha, combined with a sense of betrayal upon learning his true origins. "I don't want anyone labeled as evil anymore," he said, during one phone call. "They were victims of someone too." Maria paused, then replied, "What matters is that you are returning to the truth." A few days before the meeting, James wrote a handwritten letter to Lucia, which he asked the FBI to deliver. In careful script he wrote, "I have no memory of my mother's face or my father's name, but there has always been an emptiness in my heart that nothing has filled. If you are reading this, please know that I hold no anger toward anyone. I only want to meet the person who believed I was still alive." When Lucia received the letter, she clutched it through the night. The next day she brought it to church, placing it beside the old photograph of James and lighting a candle. "Mother," she whispered, "he is alive, and I am bringing him home." On the eve of the reunion, the FBI held a final coordination meeting at its Manhattan office. Maria outlined the security plan: 2 agents for external protection, with the psychological team remaining close by. The press would receive only a post-meeting statement. All cell phones were to be secured to ensure privacy. This is not a media event, she emphasized. It is a human journey. On the appointed day, James departed Pennsylvania in an FBI vehicle for the 4-hour drive, during which he spoke very little. As the car crossed the George Washington Bridge, he gazed down at the Hudson River, as if looking back at the place from which he had been taken 60 years earlier. The sky was overcast with a light mist, and the familiar yet alien landscape sent a shiver through him. Maria, seated beside him, asked quietly, "Are you all right?" He nodded faintly, his eyes fixed on the distance. "I think I have come back to the place where my life stopped." On the other side of the city, Lucia, accompanied by her husband and 2 grown children, had arrived at the community center. Dr. Weller reassured her. "Let whatever emotions come naturally. Do not try to control them," she nodded, gripping an old handkerchief that still held the faint scent of her mother's perfume, the only remnant of that fragrance. At 2:30 p.m., the teams took their positions. James was escorted into a softly lit waiting room. He sat in a chair, hands resting on his knees, palms sweating. The door between the 2 rooms remained closed, with only minutes remaining before it would be opened. Maria checked her watch and signaled the team to prepare. "After 60 years, she said quietly, 2 branches of a family will come together. Let them have the time that justice alone cannot provide. Reunion." In the hushed rooms of the Queens Community Center, everything was in place. Outside, the sounds of city traffic continued like a distant, enduring heartbeat that the 2 people, separated by the span of an entire lifetime, were finally about to share for the first time. When the door to the reunion room opened, the air seemed to solidify. James entered slowly, each step heavy, as if every footfall carried the weight of a lifetime. Before him sat a white-haired woman with a stern yet still refined face, seated in a wheelchair, her trembling hands gripping the armrests. This was Elena Ramirez, the mother who had lost her son when he was 4 years old, and was now 90. Her skin wrinkled, but her eyes still bright. Beside her was Alicia, his aunt, now 79, her face streaked with tears. In that moment, time appeared to stand still, leaving only the gaze between a mother and the son she had lost for 60 years. James stopped in the middle of the room, speechless, his hands shaking. Elena raised her head, scrutinizing the face of the unfamiliar man approaching her, and suddenly said in a hoarse voice, "James, is that you, my son?" He could not respond, only nodding as tears welled up. As he knelt down, she reached out and touched his cheek, as if to confirm that this was not a dream. "Mother, it's me," he choked out. "I'm sorry for making you wait." Elena began to sob, pulling him into her frail arms, her trembling hands resting on the shoulders of the son who had vanished, like a miracle. Alicia stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, murmuring, "Thank God, thank God." The reunion took place in the presence of Maria Velasquez, Dr. Weller, and 2 FBI agents. But all remained silent, allowing the emotions to flow freely in the small room. After the initial tearful moments, Dr. Weller guided them through physical verification steps, not out of doubt, but to complete the legal documentation required for restoring his identity. She gently asked, "Mrs. Ramirez, do you recall any distinguishing features from when James was a child?" Elena wiped her tears and spoke slowly. "He had a small crescent-shaped scar behind his left ear from a fall at 3 years old. It never faded." James said nothing but lifted his hair to reveal a faint silvery scar in exactly that location. The room seemed to hold its breath. Alicia covered her mouth and let out a quiet sob. Elena reached out a trembling hand to touch it, her fingertips cold yet warmer than anything else. "It's him. It's really him," she said, her voice breaking like that of a child. Next, Alicia opened an old wooden box she had brought, containing the only surviving mementos from 1955. A pair of children's shoes, a black and white photograph, and a silver necklace engraved with the initials J.R. She placed the box on the table and pushed it toward James. He looked at the necklace, picked it up with trembling hands, and said softly, "I remember this. I've seen it in my dreams. When he clasped it around his neck, Elena smiled through her tears. I put it on you that morning before we went to the park. The words silenced the room. No further proof was needed. The DNA, the scar, the artifacts, the memories, all aligned, as if the shattered pieces of a life had finally been reassembled into their original form. The reunion lasted nearly 3 hours. They spoke in fragmented sentences, laughing and crying. Elena recounted the years of waiting, the letters sent into the void, the room she had left unchanged since James disappeared. I never replaced the curtains, she said, because I was afraid you wouldn't recognize the house. James listened, tears streaming down his face, holding his mother's hand tightly. If I had known you were still waiting, I would have come back sooner, he said. Alicia spoke of his father, Carlos, who had left because he could not bear the pain of losing his son and had vanished in the south, with no further contact. The story filled the room with heavy silences. Maria stood in the background, quietly taking notes, though her eyes were red. After the emotions had settled, the legal team proceeded with the final verification for restoring his identity. James signed the identity affirmation document based on federal DNA records. Beneath the bold print, it stated, Ethan Miller affirms identity as James Ramirez. When he completed the shaky signature, Case NY 55-2041 was officially marked as solved. An FBI videographer recorded the moment for archival purposes, not for the media, but for history. Elena requested a copy of the confirmation document, carefully folding it and holding it to her chest. This is what I waited 60 years for, she said, her voice trembling like the wind. Dr. Weller, standing beside Maria, quietly remarked, we rarely see justice reach its conclusion like this. Once the formalities were complete, they were left alone in the room. Elena and Alicia sat together, still holding James's hands. They looked at one another for a long time, as if making up for 60 years of absence. James asked softly, did you ever stop believing I was alive? Elena shook her head, her eyes bright as in her youth. There were times people said I was mad, but I knew a mother's heart cannot be wrong. Alicia smiled. Your mother said that if you were alive, you would still remember the sound of the church bells. James looked up, smiling through his tears. That sound has followed me in my dreams. The three of them laughed together in the sunlit room. At the conclusion, Maria entered and announced that the FBI would issue an official statement. The disappearance of James Ramirez, New York, 1955, has been resolved. The subject is alive, his identity has been restored, and the case is closed. After a moment of silence, Elena nodded slightly. In the end, justice knows how to wait. As they left the center, the sunset bathed the city in a warm, peaceful golden light. James helped his mother to the car, his hand clasping hers, trembling yet firm. Elena looked up at her son and smiled. It turns out God only sent you away for a time. He bowed his head and whispered, I'm home now, Mother. The car door closed, enclosing the image of three people sitting side by side, past, present, and hope, while behind them, the sign for the Federal Community Center, Queens, gleamed in the light. In the final report sent to Washington, Maria wrote, on September 4, 2015, Case NY 55-2041 was officially resolved. Subject James Ramirez was reunited with his family. All biological, forensic, and witness evidence matched unequivocally. This case exemplifies the combined power of DNA technology and human persistence. File closed. As she affixed the final stamp to the report, the clock read 6 p.m. precisely as the sun set over the Manhattan skyline, its last rays filtering through the Hudson River and illuminating the buildings where it all began. After the reunion, a new chapter in James Ramirez's life began. For the first time in 60 years, he was able to live under his true name. In the following week, under guidance from the FBI and the Department of Justice, he initiated the process of restoring his legal identity, a rare but necessary procedure for long-term missing persons who are recovered. At the Civil Registry Office in Scranton, the clerk looked at the silver-haired man before her and the federal confirmation document, visibly surprised. "You want to cancel the identity of Ethan Miller?" she asked. James nodded calmly. "Not cancel it, simply restore the name to its rightful owner." The administrative division opened a restoration of birth identity file based on the DNA findings and the FBI's official certification. In the new application, he signed James Ramirez, born March 14, 1951, New York, United States. When he finished writing, he looked at the signature, a name that had been erased from the world for more than half a century, now resurrected on a blank page. 2 weeks later, the New York City Vital Records Office reissued his original birth certificate, stamped in the upper right corner with the words, "Reissued by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The documents were delivered to him through Special Agent Maria Velasquez. "You have been officially restored to the system from which you were once erased," she said. Her tone light but weighted with meaning. James took the certificate, his eyes welling up. Few people are ever born twice. With the birth certificate in hand, he proceeded to replace his passport, driver's license, and social security card. Each time he signed James Ramirez, his heart pounded, not from the bureaucracy, but from the sensation of becoming himself again. At the passport office, when asked if he wished to retain Ethan Miller as an alternate name, he smiled. "No need, Ethan was a borrowed life. James is the real one." In the federal records, his status as a missing person was updated to located. The National Archives preserved the case file in its Historic Resolution Cases collection as an exemplar of DNA application to cold case investigation. Meanwhile in Queens, Elena and Alicia prepared the small room in their home for him. The room, originally his as a child, was cleaned and repainted in a soft pale yellow, with the old picture frames rehung beside the bed. When he entered it, Elena stood in the doorway and said quietly, "I kept this room unchanged all these years, waiting for you to come home." He looked around, lightly touching a photograph of the two of them from long ago, and said hesitantly, "It feels as though I've returned from somewhere very far away." His new life began with simple things: breakfast with his mother and aunt, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, and the first calls from old neighbors who had long believed James was dead. Though media access was restricted, brief reports appeared. James Ramirez, victim of the 1955 disappearance, returns to his true identity. Strangers sent letters of congratulations, some recounting how they had helped distribute the Ramirez family's missing child flyers years earlier. Each evening, James read the letters aloud to Elena. "People still remembered me," she said. Her smile gentle but weary. He replied, "That's what kept me from disappearing entirely." Legally, the identity restoration process took nearly 4 months. A Pennsylvania state court issued an order nullifying the name Ethan Miller and recognizing James Ramirez as his sole legal identity. The document specified, all prior personal, financial, and medical records are to be transferred to the new name at the subject's request and with federal verification. On the day he received the order, he brought a copy to the nearby church and placed it before a statue of the Virgin Mary, bowing his head in prayer. Alicia accompanied him and said softly, "Your mother always hoped to see this day." She smiled, her voice hoarse. Now her wish has come true. Once all documentation was complete, the FBI transferred the entire case file to the family, formally closing the 60-year search. Maria personally delivered the black-bound volume marked "Case Closed." "James Ramirez," she said, "you are no longer a victim in a file, you are a survivor. This record is yours now." James thanked her, his eyes brimming with tears. At a small gathering in St. Michael's Church, local community representatives held a prayer service for the son of New York returned home. Neighbors who had witnessed the disappearance as children, now gray-haired, came to greet him. An elderly woman took his hand and said, "I saw that little boy in the newspapers. Seeing you now, I realize that time cannot triumph over human connection." Afterward, James went with Alicia to the banks of the Hudson River and stood silently watching the sun-dappled water. "I remember this place without ever remembering it," he said, his voice faintly trembling. Alicia placed her hand on his shoulder. "Because you never truly left. That night, back at the house, James opened an old notebook, the journal he had begun when he first uncovered the truth. On the first page, he crossed out the name Ethan Miller and wrote in firm script, James Ramirez, New York, 1951. On the next page, he wrote, after 60 years, I have found myself. There is no longer a stolen past, only a present to live. Outside the window, the city shone brightly, as if welcoming home a long-departed son. Elena slept in the next room, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. James closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the streetlights illuminate an old photograph, where a boy in a white shirt still smiled, as if greeting him on his return. After James Ramirez's identity was restored, and the case officially closed, the FBI's summary report to Washington concluded with the words, "Case closed, subject located alive." But for Special Agent Maria Velasquez, who had worked the case for 2 years, the file was never truly closed. In the final internal briefings, she and the legal analysis team continued to raise a persistent question. If Walter Hensley could abduct and raise a child for 60 years without detection, was he acting alone? The list of 8 abbreviated names found in Hensley's basement remained the greatest unresolved mystery. Beyond J.R. James Ramirez, 6 other names were recorded with birth years and the notations T or H. When analysts cross-referenced the birth dates with welfare records from neighboring states, at least 3 matched unsolved child disappearances in Massachusetts and New Jersey between 1954 and 1956. However, no concrete legal evidence linked them to an organized network. All traces of Blessing Haven, the purported adoption agency, vanished from administrative records after 1958. The name of Pastor Donnelly, listed in telephone directories, yielded no formal religious credentials beyond a temporary ministerial license issued, and later revoked in Scranton. Younger FBI investigators, despite exhaustive searches, repeatedly encountered the same response. No further data, records destroyed due to age. In an internal report, Maria wrote, "It is possible this was not an isolated incident. The operational pattern, a law enforcement figure, collaborating with a religious intermediary to place children with infertile couples, suggests an organized network shielded by authority and social trust." However, with most involved parties deceased and physical evidence limited to forged documents, there was insufficient basis to open new criminal investigations. In the final debriefing, the regional director asked, "Do you believe Hensley had accomplices?" Maria replied deliberately, "He could not have done it alone. No one could forge valid birth certificates, register new license plates, and transport children across state lines without assistance. But who and how many, we will never know." That answer was recorded verbatim in the meeting minutes, serving as an admission of the limits of their knowledge. After the report was finalized, the investigative team disbanded, and the evidence was archived in a secure vault, labeled Blessing Haven, never to be publicly released. Yet the questions lingered among investigators: how many other James Ramirez's remained undiscovered? How many children had been renamed and raised in homes mere hundreds of miles from their origins, never knowing their true identities? In 2016, an independent group of journalists published an investigative series titled The Orphans of the Northeast, which detailed the Hensley-Ramirez case for the first time. They reproduced excerpts from Martha's diary and the forged birth certificates, posing the question, if a man like Hensley could operate for decades, protected by law enforcement and religious credibility, how many others like him remain unknown? The series sparked nationwide discussion. Residents of the Northeast from the 1950s wrote to the FBI, recalling charity organizations that had approached families to relinquish children or adopt supposed war orphans. Some provided names of children who had vanished from orphanages or churches, but subsequent reviews found no surviving records. To avoid public alarm, the FBI issued a statement: "There is no verifiable evidence that an illegal adoption network remains active." Nevertheless, internally, the agency quietly launched Project Haven, using artificial intelligence to match DNA profiles from individuals adopted through unknown channels in the Northeast, with missing persons databases from the 1940s through 1960s. By the end of 2017, the system identified 8 tentative matches, insufficient for positive identification, but enough to suggest that Hensley and Donnelly were part of a larger operation. Maria, who had since retired, stated in a final interview, "Justice does not always conclude neatly. Sometimes, our task is merely to illuminate one corner of the darkness, knowing there is more shadow beyond." In his home, in Queens, James occasionally read articles about the case, but rarely commented. When a reporter asked what he thought about the possibility of other victims, he replied, "If there are any, I hope they hear their real names before they die." That concise statement was quoted in numerous publications as a credo for unresolved cases. 6 decades on, DNA technology had accomplished what generations of investigators could not. Yet it also raised questions without clear resolution, each match prompting dozens of other untouched files. The official conclusion of the James Ramirez case remained as with any solved case solved. But at the bottom of the final report, in Maria Velasquez's handwritten note, which no one on the team ever removed, were the words, "One case resolved, but how many others remain unknown, we will never know." In May 2016, 8 months after the James Ramirez case was officially closed, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in coordination with the New York Police Department, held a joint press conference to release a comprehensive summary report on the reinvestigation of the 1955 disappearance, one of the oldest cold cases ever resolved through DNA analysis. In a large conference room at the Federal Building in Manhattan, reporters, historians, and representatives from the justice system gathered in an atmosphere more solemn than a typical case announcement. Behind the podium stood a large display bearing the words Federal Review Report, Case NY 55, 2041, the Ramirez investigation. The regional special agent in charge presented a summary. "After 60 years, we have restored the identity of victim James Ramirez, clarified the sequence of criminal actions leading to the abduction, and identified procedural failures in the original investigation." The 180-page report, publicly released through the Department of Justice portal, detailed the entire process from the case being administratively suspended in 1957 to discrepancies in the original records, including the alteration of the victim's clothing description, the loss of physical evidence, and administrative interference by Lieutenant Patrick Donnelly. The report's opening section, titled "The Systemic Failures of 1955, cataloged a series of procedural violations, improper securing of the crime scene, inaccurate recording of witness statements, loss of wool fiber samples, and undocumented changes to evidence descriptions without supervisory signatures." In its conclusion, the Federal Review Board determined deficiencies in the NYPD's investigative procedures during the 1950s were the direct cause of the case remaining unresolved for more than half a century. Had proper protocols for evidence preservation and scene documentation been followed, the victim might have been located much earlier. The report was not merely an acknowledgement of errors, but a rare institutional self-examination in the history of American criminal investigation. The FBI director stated, "This case reminds us that even minor deviations can cost an entire lifetime. But it also demonstrates that modern technology and human persistence can restore justice however belatedly." A dedicated section of the report recognized Special Agent Maria Velasquez, who had reopened the case. The official notation read, "Special Agent Velasquez reconstructed the entire file, identified indications of document tampering, and restored the original chain of evidence, directly contributing to the victim's identity verification. She was recommended for commendation for exceptional contributions to cold case investigations." Following the presentation, the review board released results from an independent audit by the Department of Justice Inspector General's office, which corroborated the evidence of deliberate record alterations and evidence mishandling. However, as all involved parties were deceased, no criminal prosecutions were pursued. On behalf of the original investigating agency, the NYPD issued a public apology to the Ramirez family. "We acknowledge our historical responsibility and share in the family's prolonged loss over 60 years." In the audience, James and his family sat in the front row. As the apology was read, they held hands and bowed their heads without speaking. It was not a belated gesture, but a formal recognition that justice, however delayed, had been acknowledged, even if by those with no direct connection to the events. The latter portion of the press conference focused on future recommendations. Drawing from the Ramirez case, the FBI proposed a national program called the Legacy DNA Initiative, a project to collect and store DNA reference samples for all historical child disappearance cases, including those without original biological evidence. The initiative would partner with state law enforcement agencies to expand searches across more than 6,000 pre-1980 missing persons files. The FBI director stated, "If James Ramirez could be located after 60 years, it means hundreds, perhaps thousands of other cases can still be solved." Concurrently, the NYPD announced the establishment of a digitized evidence preservation unit tasked with scanning and backing up all legacy physical records to prevent loss or manual alteration. The report's closing provision stated, "Beginning in fiscal year 2017, all cold case child disappearances with surviving family members will undergo DNA testing, regardless of statutory time limitations." This established the James Ramirez case as legal precedent, opening new avenues for modern investigation. During the conference, Maria Velasquez was invited to speak briefly. She approached the podium and said firmly yet warmly, "We cannot change the past, but we can ensure it is not repeated. Every old case file is a forgotten cry for help, and it is our duty to listen." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not only for the resolution of the case, but because her words resonated with the fundamental ethos of investigation, that justice is not an endpoint, but an ongoing commitment. Following the press conference, major media outlets published the full report. The New York Times headlined, "FBI and NYPD acknowledge historical failures, launch national DNA program based on Riverside Park case." The Washington Post observed, "One case is closed, but it leaves a legacy for thousands of others." In an evening news segment, a family member appeared briefly and said simply, "If our efforts help locate even one more missing child, then 60 years of waiting will not have been in vain." That statement was included in the official report as the final notation in the societal impact section. Thus, from a case long presumed lost to oblivion, the James Ramirez file became a historical benchmark, not merely closing one tragedy, but forging a new chapter in investigative practice, where past errors are revisited not to assign blame, but to underscore that in every pursuit of justice, the essential principle remains: never to abandon the search. The impact of the James Ramirez case extended far beyond the expectations of investigators. Immediately after the FBI and NYPD released their summary report, the American media erupted with hundreds of articles, news reports, and documentaries exploring the story of the boy who returned after 60 years. Major television networks such as CNN, NBC, and ABC aired special programs titled "The Boy Who Came Home." Within 1 week, more than 50 million people followed the news, making the name James Ramirez a new symbol of hope for thousands of families with missing loved ones. The press hailed DNA technology as the miracle of the 21st century, while simultaneously raising questions about the accountability of the old investigative system. The New York Times published an editorial titled, "One Child Found, One Generation's Failures Recalled." The article analyzed how, had the authorities of that time not made critical errors, James might not have spent 60 years living under another person's name. The social effects arrived more rapidly than anticipated. In the first month after the announcement, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received more than 20,000 requests from families to submit DNA samples for children who had gone missing decades earlier. Many who had long abandoned hope now returned, believing that if James could be found after 60 years, their own child could be as well. Genetic testing laboratories across the country were overwhelmed. The government established 2 additional processing centers in Denver and Atlanta to meet the demand. On social media, the hashtag #FindThemAll spread widely, accompanied by images of James and the slogan, "One case solved, thousands still waiting." In eastern states, community groups began establishing funds to provide free DNA testing for low-income families. Television networks aired segments called DNA Diaries, recounting the stories of those searching for lost relatives. Some individuals found answers. A woman in Maine discovered that her sister, missing since 1962, had been adopted in Canada. A man in Ohio received confirmation that unidentified remains found in 1970 belonged to his brother. Though such cases were few, they reinforced public belief that miracles could be repeated. Meanwhile, in New York State, the state legislature held special hearings titled Cold Case Reform Hearing. The chair of the Judiciary Committee opened the proceedings by stating, "The James Ramirez case is not merely a personal tragedy, but a national lesson. It exposes the limitations of the old record-keeping system and demands comprehensive reform." Over 3 days, forensic experts, investigators, and legislators debated modernizing evidence storage protocols, digitizing data, and mandating DNA sampling for all unsolved child abduction cases predating 1980. Several younger lawmakers cited the Riverside Park case directly. A single lost fiber delayed justice for 60 years. Had a DNA sample retention system existed at the time, history would have been different. The first proposal passed was the New York State Missing Children Genetic Archiving Act, which required all state police agencies to review and retain DNA samples for all unsolved child abduction cases, regardless of statutory limitations. Concurrently, the state legislature approved funding to digitize more than 200,000 cold case files and transfer them to a federal system accessible via automated genetic genealogy search tools. The debate soon reached the federal level, with several members of Congress proposing a nationwide expansion of the program. A special Senate committee invited experts to testify, including Special Agent Maria Velasquez, who had led the Ramirez investigation. During her testimony, she stated, "We cannot give James Ramirez back the 60 years he lost, but we can ensure that no other child has to wait as long." That brief statement was quoted on the front page of the Washington Post under the headline, "The Woman Who Gave a Name Back." Public opinion overwhelmingly supported reform. Columbia Law School introduced a dedicated seminar course titled Cold Cases and Genetic Justice, using the Ramirez case as its primary case study. Students were required to analyze the failures of the 1955 investigation and the solutions offered by 21st-century forensic methods. At the societal level, the case's impact extended beyond policy. Many families who had concealed adoptions began disclosing the truth to their children, fearing they were perpetuating a secret similar to that of the Hensley family. Child welfare organizations established hotlines for individuals questioning their origins. Call volume tripled within 3 months. Numerous newspapers ran series titled Lost Identities, chronicling individuals who discovered they had been living under false identities. Part of the public began debating the ethical boundary between the good intentions of adoption and the act of usurpation. The Department of Health and Human Services issued formal guidelines for secure adoption procedures, emphasizing the importance of verifying legal origins. In popular culture, Hollywood quickly took notice. A production company announced a feature film based on James Ramirez's story, while publishers competed to release his memoir. Although the Ramirez family declined to participate in commercial projects, they permitted the use of case records for educational purposes. When interviewed on NPR, James said simply, "If my story convinces someone that the truth never truly disappears, then it is worth telling." In New York, an exhibition titled The Long Way Home was mounted at the City Museum of New York, displaying case documents, photographs, and evidence. The largest image superimposed 2 faces, the 4-year-old James in 1955 and the man he had become in 2015, captioned, "Between them lie 60 years of silence." Visitors left thousands of heartfelt notes, many writing the names of their own missing loved ones and affixing them to a collective memory wall. A Time magazine commentator observed, "James Ramirez is not merely a victim who was found, he is a symbol of America's memory, where the past and science join hands to correct past mistakes." Nevertheless, some expressed concern that widespread DNA testing could infringe on privacy rights. Certain human rights organizations urged the government to ensure that genetic samples were used solely for investigative purposes and not shared with commercial entities. That debate continues, but regardless of agreement or opposition, all acknowledge that the James Ramirez case fundamentally changed how American society views justice. From a child forgotten in a dusty file, James became the voice compelling an entire nation to confront its responsibility toward the missing. And in the final days of 2016, as television replayed the news report, "A boy found after 60 years," the image of him sitting between his mother and aunt, smiling serenely, became the emblem of a new era, one in which justice is no longer measured by time, but by the conviction that no one is truly lost as long as the search continues. As the media storm subsided, James Ramirez, the man who had lived as Ethan Miller for 60 years, began a second life. No longer merely a figure in investigative files or headlines, he became a living symbol of hope and the bearer of that story for those still searching. In 2017, he accepted an invitation from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to participate in the Return Project, an initiative for victims recovered after prolonged disappearances. Initially planning only a brief appearance at a sharing event, he stood before an audience of dozens of families holding photographs of their missing loved ones, and could say only, "I was once one of the faces in your pictures." The room fell silent, then erupted in prolonged applause. From that moment, James embarked on a new journey, not to escape his past, but to help others confront theirs. He worked with a team of psychological counselors to develop support programs for kidnapping survivors, aiding their reintegration into society after recovering their true identities. He explained that the greatest challenge was not survival, but learning to live when everything one knew proved to be a lie. "When I discovered I was not Ethan, I did not know whether to pity or resent myself. But I realized that forgiveness was not for the woman who abducted me, but for the life that had cost me 60 years, he shared during a panel discussion in Washington. His remarks were quoted in psychology journals, opening new lines of research into identity trauma in long-term missing persons cases. That same year, he began writing a memoir titled The Longest Return. The book was not a chronicle of the investigation, but an account of his internal journey, from the boy raised by strangers to the middle-aged man discovering his true self. "I have no memory of the day I was taken, but I remember the nights I dreamed of church bells and woke crying without understanding why," he wrote in the opening chapter. The memoir was quickly embraced by publishers and became a landmark in contemporary autobiographical literature on identity recovery. In its final chapter, he referred to his mother, Elena, in gentle terms. "She did not need DNA evidence to believe I was alive." Sometimes, faith can stand in for science. When the book was published in early 2018, James participated in book signings, no longer shunning the media. Speaking to a CNN reporter, he said, "I do not tell my story to elicit pity, I tell it so that those still searching will understand that miracles occur only when belief does not cease." The book inspired hundreds of letters each month, from families of the missing and adoptees uncertain of their origins. James read every letter, made notes, and replied to many by hand. In his small home office in Queens, 2 photographs always sat on his desk. One of the 4-year-old boy taken at Riverside Park in 1955, and a recent photograph of himself with his mother and aunt. "They remind me that I was once lost, but also that I was found," he said. At the same time, he collaborated with the FBI and NSMIC on public education campaigns about DNA technology. He participated in university seminars, sharing first-hand experiences of testing, identity verification, and the importance of genetic sample preservation. In a lecture at Columbia University, he stated, "DNA is not merely a string of biological code, it is the testimony of memory, the pathway home for those who have been forgotten." The speech was reprinted in Forensic Science Review as an exemplary integration of science and humanism. That year, he was invited to serve as an honorary advisor to the Legacy DNA Initiative, the program established in the wake of his case. His role was to connect with victims' families, helping them understand testing procedures, alleviating their fears, and encouraging cooperation with law enforcement. He became a bridge between those who had suffered loss and those seeking justice. Many young investigators regarded him as living proof of the value of their work. In 2019, James was invited to the National Missing But Not Forgotten commemoration event in Washington, D.C., where hundreds of families carried photographs of their still unrecovered loved ones and lit candles. When he took the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Speaking slowly in a steady, resonant voice, he said, "I was once one of the people you are searching for. I know the pain of having no answers, but remember that no matter how many years pass, a person does not truly disappear as long as we continue to remember them." Afterward, dozens approached to shake his hand or embrace him, calling him the James of the lost children. An elderly woman told him, "My daughter disappeared in 1978. I do not know if I will ever see her again, but because of you, I still have hope." He took her hand and replied quietly, "Hope is the one thing a kidnapper can never take away." The image of him lighting the first candle, symbolizing the resolution of cold cases, became a defining media symbol that year. People magazine titled its coverage, "The Man Who Returned to Light the Way for Those Still Lost." Following the event, James continued his work as a volunteer within CEMEC. He called families who received new DNA results, helping them understand the process and prepare emotionally. Whenever a cold case was resolved, he sent congratulatory letters, always concluding with the words, "Every person who is found belongs to all of us." His personal life returned to normal. His mother, Elena, grew frail but lived long enough to see him receive a government commendation for contributions to genetic justice. She passed away in his arms at the end of 2019. In her eulogy, James said, "She waited for me for 60 years, and I believe she has only gone on ahead to prepare the way." Afterward, he returned to Pennsylvania, the former home of Ethan Miller, cleared out the old workshop, and donated all records and artifacts to the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington. "So that people remember not to harbor resentment," he explained. Beginning in 2020, he lived quietly in Queens, devoting most of his time to writing, consulting, and participating in annual commemorations for missing persons. Despite his advancing age, he appeared regularly at every event, always carrying a white candle, the symbol of return. "I was found," he said, at one ceremony, "and therefore I will spend the rest of my life searching for others." That statement was inscribed on a memorial plaque in the CEMEC Auditorium. James Ramirez, found alive, 2015. Still searching, forever. One autumn morning in 2021, exactly 6 years after his reunion, James Ramirez returned to where it all began. Riverside Park on Manhattan's west side. The sky was softly gray, and a breeze from the Hudson River carried the faint, briny scent of water. He walked slowly along the newly paved stone path, where trees now stood twice as tall as they had in the memories of those who lived in the 1950s. Beside him were retired Special Agent Maria Velasquez and his Aunt Alicia, now in her 80s. They walked together in silence, allowing the sound of their footsteps on the old ground to recount a history of quiet endurance. At the end of the path, where James had once played on a grassy area before vanishing, he stopped. In his hands, he held a bouquet of white daisies, the flowers his mother had loved. The wind gently lifted the petals, scattering them into the air. He knelt and placed the bouquet beside a small bronze plaque recently erected by city officials. It was inscribed, "In memory of the lost children of New York, may they all find their way home." Below it read smaller text, "Dedicated to James Ramirez, found alive after 60 years." He read the words aloud, his eyes welling with tears. 60 years earlier, this spot had marked the beginning of a tragedy. Now it marked the closing of a circle. Alicia placed her hand on his shoulder and said softly, Elena wanted you to come here. She said that if you ever returned, you should let the flowers serve as thanks. James smiled, his gaze distant as he looked toward the Hudson River, where sunlight glinted on the water. He stood for a long time, allowing the breeze to stir his coat and silver hair. From across the river came the sound of church bells, the sound he had heard in dreams throughout the years he lived as Ethan Miller. It was no longer a vague echo of memory, but the sound of homecoming. Maria stood back, watching the man she had helped recover his identity. In her hands was a slim folder, the final copy of Case File NY55, 2041, stamped in red with closed 2015. She placed it on a nearby bench beside the bouquet, as a farewell to a long chapter of justice. Everything began here, and it ends here, she said quietly. James turned and nodded, his voice low. No, it does not end. It simply returns to where it belongs. He walked to the iron railing overlooking the water, where the Hudson continued its ceaseless flow, like time itself, capable of sweeping things away, but unable to erase all traces. The wind brought a sharp chill that brought tears to his eyes, but he did not turn away. In that moment, he was neither the man called James Ramirez nor Ethan Miller, but simply the 4-year-old boy who had finally come home to familiar ground in a changed world. A group of schoolchildren passed by, pausing to read the plaque as their teacher recounted the story of the boy who disappeared in 1955 and was found after 60 years. James overheard and smiled. Those children would likely never fully comprehend it, but he knew his story had become a living lesson in hope. Alicia looked at her nephew and said quietly, "Your mother would be so proud," he replied. His voice as soft as a breath. "I am proud that I found her." They sat together on the bench watching walkers and hearing laughter echoing through the park. Life had passed too long to demand more. And in James's eyes, there was no longer any doubt, only the peace of one who finally knows where he belongs. As the sun began to set, he opened a small notebook, the same journal he had kept in Pennsylvania, and added a final entry in blue ink on the last page. "Return to the place where I disappeared, no longer missing." He closed the notebook and placed it beside the bouquet, then stood silently with hands clasped. The afternoon breeze carried the mingled scents of river water and daisies along the shore. The sky turned to pale orange, mirrored on the Hudson like a reflection of time itself. Maria checked her watch and approached him. "We should go." James turned to her with a smile. "I came home a long time ago." The words stopped her. In his eyes, there was no remaining entanglement, only the serenity of one who had traversed an entire lifetime to reclaim the final piece of himself. As they left the park, the sunset illuminated the path and cast a final glow on the memorial plaque. The words engraved in bronze reflected the sun's red light, shining more brightly than ever. Case NY55, 2041. The disappearance of 4-year-old James Ramirez from Riverside Park in 1955 was officially archived as closed found alive, marking one of the rarest forensic triumphs in United States history. But what remained beyond the statistics and reports was not bureaucratic closure, but the story of a person erased from the world who found his way back, not only for himself, but for all those still awaiting the moment their name would be called. That evening, a local news broadcast replayed footage of James at Riverside Park, accompanied by the caption, "No disappearance is too old for the truth to be found." The image of him standing by the Hudson River, his silver hair catching the sunset, became the emblem closing a journey that had spanned 6 decades, a journey of pain, science, and ultimately faith. And when the screen went dark, only the gentle lapping of waves against the shore remained, a reminder that though time passes, the truth patiently awaits the moment it will be seen. The story of James Ramirez. The boy abducted in 1955 and found after 60 years is not merely the resolution of a single case, but a mirror reflecting contemporary American society, a place where technology, justice, and human conviction intersect. In an era where information can be buried amid millions of new data points each day, James's journey to reclaim his identity underscores the power of collective memory, that truth does not vanish, but waits to be seen through different eyes. The FBI's admission of procedural errors in the 1955 investigation serves as a stark reminder of institutional accountability. Transparency does not weaken a system, but makes it enduring. In today's America, where trust in institutions, media, and one another is often tested, this story becomes a call to confront past mistakes, not to divide, but to heal. Just as James had to learn to forgive the stolen years of his life, American society must learn to acknowledge its errors in the same spirit. Furthermore, the fact that thousands of families submitted DNA samples in the wake of the case's resolution demonstrates growing faith in science, but also serves as a caution that technology has meaning only when wielded with ethics and humanity. James's final words at Riverside Park, "I came home a long time ago," apply not only to him, but to all those still seeking justice. Homecoming is sometimes not a physical return, but the discovery of truth, belief, and compassion within the society one inhabits. In a turbulent America, that is the most essential journey home. Thank you for joining us in the story of James Ramirez's journey back, a testament that the truth may be buried, but it never truly disappears. Please subscribe to the channel to continue following those cases that have been solved after many decades, where justice and compassion always find their way back.